What if your biggest threat wasn't an enemy, it was your own blood? Behind every crown lies a family feud, and in these 53 stories, the throne becomes a trap. Fathers slain by sons, wives turning on kings, brothers rewriting history with a single dagger. This isn't just royalty, it's betrayal dressed in silk. Tonight, we open the royal crypt. And the bodies? They all have the same last name. This is 53 kings and queens murdered by their own family. Let the succession crisis begin. Before we descend into the royal bloodbath, a quick word from the throne room. If you're into dark history, twisted dynasties, and bedtime stories that make you question your family group chat, hit that subscribe button. We drop deep dives like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Is this your midnight obsession or your morning commute into madness? Either way, we're glad you're here. Constantine VI. Imagine being blinded by your own mother. Not metaphorically, physically. No kingdom metaphor here. No Shakespearean, "Oh, my mother does not see me," lament. We mean blinded knives, needles. Whatever Byzantine sadism happened to be trending in 797 AD. Constantine VI, Emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, came into power young, too young to hold it on his own. His mother, Empress Irene, stepped in as regent. She was elegant, pious, politically gifted, and by all accounts, terrifying. For a while, things looked like a classic co-regency. The mother shields the son grows strong, the power is handed over. Right? Number Irene liked power. Too much. Once Constantine came of age, he tried to push her aside, but her grip was too tight. He fumbled his reign with unpopular wars, questionable alliances, and public floggings of his own generals. The people mocked him, the church opposed him, the army distrusted him, and through it all, Irene just smiled. Eventually, in a move only someone with deep, unapologetic Oedipal issues could pull off, she had her own son seized. He was dragged away, restrained, and blinded in a ritual of imperial mutilation. Not in secret, in public, not by assassins, by her orders, in the same purple palace where he was born. The idea was that a blind emperor couldn't rule, but Irene wasn't done yet. After the blinding, Constantine disappeared from public life. Most historians believe he died from the wounds shortly after. Irene, meanwhile, declared herself the sole ruler, the first woman to ever rule the Byzantine Empire, in her own name. And how did history reward her? The empire spiraled into economic ruin, the army fell into disrepair, and she was eventually overthrown by a finance minister. Even the church that once supported her turned away, uneasy with the whole mum-turned-murderer aesthetic. But the real mystery isn't why Irene blinded her son. The Byzantine court was a place where ambition and cruelty went hand in hand. The real mystery is how she lived with it afterward. Some say she repented, withdrew into monastic life. Others say she felt no remorse at all. The truth is, we'll never know. What we do know is that somewhere in a sunless chamber, behind marble walls and gold leaf mosaics, a boy emperor once screamed for a mother who came instead with knives. And then she sat on his throne. Not to be outdone, our next ruler also had a woman by his side. But instead of a mother, it was a wife, and instead of knives, she used a glass of poisoned wine served cold, like betrayal. Romanos II. Romanos II was what you might call a decorative emperor, beautiful, young, and largely ornamental. In his mid-20s, he ascended to the Byzantine throne in 959 AD, marrying the famously ambitious Theophano. She was clever, calculating, and stunning, a lethal combination in any century. Theophano wasn't born noble. She was the daughter of an innkeeper, a commoner. But she caught the eye of Constantine VII's son, Romanos II, and suddenly she was empress. Just like that. No wars. No schemes. Just charm, ambition, and a wedding. At first, it seemed like a good match. Romanos delegated most of his imperial duties to his generals and court officials, spending his days hunting, feasting, and not ruling. Theophano, however, quickly became something else entirely. She wasn't just an empress. She was a shadow government with better fashion sense. She was linked quietly, whisperingly, to the sudden deaths of Romanos's powerful in-laws. Then, shockingly, his own father, Constantine VII, died suddenly, not long after Theophano entered the palace. Coincidence? Perhaps. Or perhaps a pattern was forming, invisible to everyone, except the people dying in it. In 963, Romanos II himself suddenly died at the age of 25. Healthy the day before, dead the next. The official cause was exhaustion from hunting. A poetic lie. Most sources at the time, and nearly every historian since, have pointed the finger at Theophano. It was too convenient, too fast, too silent, too deadly. With Romanos gone, Theophano didn't mourn. She maneuvered. She installed her sons as child emperors, declared herself regent, and seduced the empire's leading general, Nicephorus Phocas, later elevating him to co-emperor. Which raises the question, did she kill Romanos out of political necessity, or because she simply could? That's the thing about imperial history. It reads like theatre. Every death is a scene change. Every betrayal is a costume swap. But Theophano's story doesn't end with power. It ends with more poison, more betrayal, and a coup against her. Because when you build your palace on bodies, eventually the floor gives out. Still, Romanos's death remains officially unsolved. No trial, no proof. Just a young emperor who went hunting, came home for dinner, and never woke up. And if you think that was subtle, wait until you meet our next emperor, a teenager who barely got the crown on his head before his own cousin wrapped a noose around it. And just like that, 2 crowns down, both buried by the people closest to them. If you're already hooked on this royal unraveling, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's lurking further down the bloodline. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it on your end? Is this your late night deep dive, or an early morning descent into dynasty-level dysfunction? Either way, you're in the right place. Alexios II Komnenos. In the chaotic chessboard of the late Byzantine Empire, Alexios II Komnenos was less a player and more a pawn, one of those doomed pieces born into grandeur and marched directly into slaughter. He became emperor at age 10, a title with no power, a crown with no weight. His real guardians were his mother, Maria of Antioch, and his cousin Andronikos I Komnenos, who arrived at court claiming to be the empire's savior. Andronikos had charm, military prestige, and a backstory that read like exile fiction. Plots, prisons, escapes, exile, more plots. He was the black sheep of the dynasty, the kind of man who made everyone nervous, especially when he started smiling. Under the guise of protecting Alexios, Andronikos wormed his way into court. He painted Maria as a Latin sympathizer, a foreigner who endangered the empire. People believed him. After all, she was French, blonde, Catholic, Everything the Byzantine nobility hated. Then, in a sequence of events that can only be described as one long, calculated betrayal, Andronikos had Maria imprisoned, then executed. With the empress out of the way, he stood next to Alexios II as his protector. The people cheered, the court relaxed, and then he had the boy strangled. Some say it was quick, others say it happened slowly, ceremonially, like everything else in Byzantium. Andronikos took the throne for himself, justifying the murder as a necessary purge. The empire, he said, couldn't be ruled by a child, especially not one who trusted him. And here's the twist. Andronikos wasn't a mad tyrant, not yet. His early reign saw reforms, anti-corruption campaigns, laws protecting peasants. For a moment, it looked like murder had actually saved the empire. But power, as always, rots from within. Paranoia crept in. Reprisals multiplied. Executions rained like spring floods. Within 2 years, the people rose up and tore Andronikos apart in the streets. Literally. So, Alexios II was dead. His mother, dead. His cousin, dead. The empire staggered forward. And if you're wondering whether this level of intra-family horror was a Byzantine specialty, well, yes. But Rome did it first. And when Rome did it, they didn't hide the blood. They spilled it right into the folds of a mother's dress. Geta. Rome, 211 AD. The imperial palace was quiet, too quiet for a city that liked to shout its greatness through columns and conquest. Inside, 2 brothers co-emperors were supposed to be ruling side by side. What they were actually doing was plotting how to outlive one another. The brothers were Geta and Caracalla, sons of Septimius Severus. When their father died, he did something no Roman emperor before him had tried. He split power between his sons. Not out of idealism, but desperation. He knew they hated each other. He thought if they both had a crown, they'd at least keep each other alive out of fear. Wrong. The moment Severus was buried, the palace transformed into a cold war. Caracalla and Geta divided it like roommates who had broken up but couldn't afford to move out. 2 sides. 2 courts, 2 guards, 2 dining halls, even 2 sets of imperial body doubles, just in case. The only thing they didn't divide was their mother, Julia Domna. And that, perhaps, was the mistake. Julia tried to mediate, at least in public. Privately, she must have known it couldn't last. Caracalla was brutal and ambitious. Geta more scholarly, more cautious qualities that in Rome were often mistaken for weakness. The Senate preferred Geta. The army leaned toward Caracalla. Eventually, Caracalla made his move. He invited Geta to a peace meeting. A reconciliation. Neutral ground. No guards. Just family. It was a lie. What happened next is a moment etched into Roman folklore, not for its violence, but for its intimacy. Geta walked into the meeting. Julia was there. Caracalla was there. And before the second round of platitudes could be offered, Caracalla gave a signal. Guards rushed in. Geta ran to his mother. And that was that. Caracalla declared himself sole emperor, staged a mourning ceremony he did not attend, and ordered a damnatio memoriae on his brother, a memory wipe. Statues were smashed, names erased, coins defaced, histories edited, as if Geta had never existed. It didn't work. People remembered. You always remember the family members you're not allowed to talk about. What makes this story so cold isn't just the betrayal, it's the emptiness of its justification. Caracalla ruled alone afterward, yes, but his reign became a paranoid spiral. he executed senators by the dozens. He widened the citizenship base of Rome not out of generosity, but so he could tax more people. Eventually, he was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier while urinating on the side of the road. Fitting, really. A man who erased his brother's memory couldn't hold on to his own legacy either. And so ends the story of Geta, not with a war, not with a revolution, but with a family meeting that turned into a murder scene. The quiet kind, the kind that leaves no mess. Just silence and a mother who had to watch. And if you think dying in your mother's arms is the lowest point royalty can reach, you clearly haven't met the next king whose wife didn't just betray him, she rewrote his death into an English bedtime story. Edward II. Edward II of England didn't rule so much as he wandered through rule. A king without instinct, a monarch without bite. Edward was better suited to farming than to war. He loved manual labour. He built canals. He dabbled in thatched roof infrastructure. This, unfortunately, was not what the English nobility wanted in the middle of the 14th century. They wanted a warrior. What they got was a romantic. And Edward was deeply, sincerely, inconveniently romantic. His favourites, most notably Piers Gaveston, became lightning rods for baronial hatred. The nobility seethed, Parliament plotted. Gaveston was eventually hunted down and executed, leaving Edward hollowed and humiliated. Into this vacuum of power stepped Queen Isabella, a French princess married off to Edward at 12. She watched her husband's infatuations and misjudgments with growing contempt. At first, she played her role, dutiful queen, political asset, but after years of neglect and humiliation, she changed roles. She became the conspirator. In 1325, Isabella travelled to France on a diplomatic mission. She didn't return. Instead, she gathered allies, secured her son's future, and partnered with an ambitious nobleman, Roger Mortimer, who, it turns out, was not just a political partner. Isabella raised an army and invaded England in 1326. With barely a fight, Edward's kingdom collapsed around him. He fled, he was captured, and soon he was deposed in favour of his 4-year-old son, Edward III. Officially, Edward II abdicated voluntarily. Unofficially, it was the end of the road. But the real mystery is what happened next. Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, supposedly treated well, still technically alive, but within a year news came. The former king was dead. Natural causes, they said. The flu, maybe. A chill. Nobody believed it. The rumours were fast and colourful. Assassination by red-hot poker, or starvation, or suffocation. The details changed, but the assumption remained. Isabella had ordered her husband's death, and Mortimer had carried it out. Of course, there was no trial, no witnesses, just an official statement and a hasty funeral. Years later, when Isabella fell from grace and her son took real power, even he didn't reopen the case. And maybe that was the real punishment. Edward II died not with justice, but with ambiguity, erased, rewritten, speculated upon. A king remembered not for what he did, but for how little anyone wanted him around. And if a betrayed husband turned into a royal ghost story doesn't unsettle you, try imagining being 13, locked in a tower, and waiting for an uncle who never opens the door. Richard II. Some monarchs lose their thrones in battle, some through treason. Richard II lost his crown the way some people lose at chess, slowly, arrogantly, and without ever realizing the game had already ended. He came to power young. That was his first disadvantage. The second was that he genuinely believed in divine kingship, as in, God had chosen him, personally, to rule England. A poetic idea, beautiful in sermons and coronations, less helpful when your nobles are armed, hungry for land, and deeply suspicious of anyone who calls himself God's deputy on earth. Richard wasn't a tyrant, not exactly. He was dramatic, vain, obsessed with art, fashion, symbolism. He spent more time designing royal emblems than managing royal policies. He loved ceremony, processions, robes, mirrors. He didn't want to rule England. He wanted to perform England. Unfortunately, the kingdom wasn't in a theatrical mood. His reign saw revolts, including the infamous Peasants' Revolt, which Richard barely navigated through a mix of charisma and last-minute betrayal. He made enemies long-lasting, generational enemies, by exiling powerful nobles and seizing their land. One of those exiles was Henry Bolingbroke, his cousin. Richard banished him, seized his inheritance, and assumed that was that. But the thing about cousins in exile, they come back. In 1399, while Richard was away in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned to England not as a rebel, but as a loyal subject who just wanted his family lands back. Classic excuse. By the time Richard returned, he found his support eroded, the nobles flipped, and his cousin sitting in his throne room with a list of grievances and a polite suggestion that he abdicate. Richard surrendered, he was imprisoned, and in 1400, he died in custody. The official version says he starved to death. Some say it was voluntary, some say it wasn't. Either way, it didn't take long. Richard's body was displayed publicly to prove he was dead. Henry, now Henry IV, wore black for mourning and gold for victory. What makes this regicide so quietly chilling is that it was framed not as a murder, but as a correction. Richard had mismanaged the realm. His cousin had simply restored balance. Nothing personal, just dynastic maintenance. And perhaps the greatest irony? Richard was a lover of words, poetry, and memory. He commissioned elaborate tombs and recited verses about legacy. But he died alone, unburied for weeks, and remembered only as a cautionary tale. Which raises the question, what happens when your own blood decides your legacy is better off without you? To answer that, we go from deposed kings in England to a boy king locked in a tower, whose only mistake was being born between two ambitious brothers, Edward V. He was never crowned, that's the first clue. Edward V, the 12-year-old son of Edward IV, became king in 1483, but only in name. He didn't wear the crown, he didn't hold a scepter, he didn't sit on the throne. He just walked into the Tower of London with his younger brother, supposedly for safekeeping before the coronation, and never came out again. Officially, the story goes like this. After Edward IV died suddenly, the young heir and his brother were placed under the protection of their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was supposed to act as Lord Protector until the boy came of age. Instead, he declared the boys illegitimate, annulled their claim to the throne, and crowned himself Richard III. Neat, clean, bloodless on paper. The princes, Edward and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury, vanished inside the tower. No funeral, no official death. Just 2 empty rooms and 2 children who stopped being seen. Rumours swirled. Theories bloomed. Did Richard III have them killed? Did a sympathizer rescue them in secret? Were they smothered, strangled, spirited away? No answers, only shadows. What makes the story so magnetic is how little we actually know. Centuries later, bones were found in the tower, sparking fresh debates. Were they the boys? Were they not? Historians argued. Monarchists shifted uncomfortably. The official line stayed vague. Meanwhile, Richard III reigned briefly and nervously. He launched reforms, tried to prove he wasn't a child-murdering usurper, but the rumor never left him. It clung to his name like fog. When he was eventually killed in battle by Henry Tudor, becoming the last English king to die in war, the legend only grew. The Tudors, of course, had every reason to turn the tale into a Gothic tragedy. They painted Richard III as a villain, a hunchbacked tyrant who murdered his nephews for a crown. Shakespeare picked up the brush and turned it into theatre. "My kingdom for a horse" became more memorable than any footnote in a chronicle. And what of Edward VI? He became the ultimate symbol of stolen youth. A monarch erased before he ever had the chance to rule. A boy lost not to war, but to ambition. His reign lasted 2 months longer than his freedom. His power was a placeholder, his life a threat to his uncle. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes it's also shaped by the silences, by the questions no one dares answer, and the voices that fade too soon. Next, we head to Castile, where kings didn't disappear quietly. They bled in the dirt at the hands of their own brothers, and this time, the one called the Cruel wasn't the villain of the story. Peter I the Cruel. If your historical nickname is the Cruel, you'd expect the story to end with you on top of a pile of bodies, staring coldly over your scorched empire, crown still gleaming. But for Peter I of Castile, that crown ended up in his brother's hand, and the pile of bodies included his own. Born into the royal house of Castile in the 14th century, Peter inherited the throne at 16. Almost immediately, he gained a reputation. His enemies called him El Cruel. His supporters called him El Justiciero, the Just. As usual, the truth sat somewhere between propaganda and slander. Peter was intense. That's the polite word. He ruled with sharp efficiency and punished rebellion like it was a sport. Nobles who crossed him tended not to cross again. He was also famously fixated on honor and revenge traits that don't mix well in a medieval monarchy, with too many cousins and not enough trust. And then came Henry. Henry of Trastamara, Peter's half-brother, was born out of wedlock but raised like royalty. He didn't have a legitimate claim to the throne, but legitimacy in 14th century Castile was more of a mood than a rule. Henry gathered allies, nobles angry at Peter's purges, foreign support from France, and backing from Aragon. Even the Pope didn't mind him. War broke out. Civil war. The kind with no clear beginning and no clean end. Peter, despite his name, wasn't the monster his enemies made him out to be. He tried diplomacy. He even made alliances with England and the famed Black Prince, son of Edward III. For a moment, it looked like Peter might win. But betrayal is a family tradition in monarchies. In 1369, the two brothers met at the Battle of Montiel. Peter was captured after the fighting lured into a trap under the guise of negotiation. What followed wasn't a trial, it wasn't an execution. It was a family reunion with only one chair. Henry emerged victorious and immediately took the throne, rebranding himself as Henry II. He rewrote the narrative. Peter was now a tyrant, a madman, a king whose death was a public service. The courts echoed it, the chroniclers recorded it, and for centuries, that's how the story stood. But the mystery isn't about who killed Peter. It's why his legacy was rewritten with such desperation. Was it guilt, or was it fear that the rightful king had died not as a tyrant, but as a warning? Because when you kill your brother and take his crown, you don't just rewrite history, you inherit its judgment. And speaking of kings brought down by kin, Let's go further north, Scotland, where a crown was never enough, and family dinners were never safe from ambition sharpened by prophecy. Duncan Ide. History remembers Duncan Vi of Scotland, primarily for one thing: being murdered by Macbeth. Yes, that Macbeth, the one Shakespeare immortalized with witches, daggers, and guilt-soaked hallucinations. But the real story is messier, stranger, and somehow even darker. Duncan became king in 1034, not through conquest or election, but succession. He was the grandson of King Malcolm II and came into the crown relatively young and untested. Charismatic? Perhaps. Competent? Debatable. His reign was marked by a series of failed military campaigns, especially in northern Scotland and against the Norse in Moray. It was in Moray that his troubles truly began, because Moray was Macbeth's turf. Macbeth wasn't just a nobleman, he was the Mormaer of Moray, essentially a regional king in all but name. He was also Duncan's first cousin. And while Shakespeare would have you believe Macbeth was a scheming social climber manipulated by prophecy and an overly dramatic wife, in truth, he had a strong legal claim to the throne through his own royal blood. And he had grievances. Duncan's attempts to exert control over the Scottish North were viewed as heavy-handed and ill-informed. Nobles grumbled. Armies floundered. Even Duncan's own court began to question whether the young king was leading them anywhere but backward. In 1040, Duncan led a campaign into Moray, an attempt to bring Macbeth to heel. Instead, he lost. Badly. Now, here's where the mystery deepens. Duncan died in battle, not in the shadows, not from poison or betrayal behind closed doors. He died trying to lead his men against his cousin's forces and was struck down in the field. Macbeth didn't sneak the crown from under a pillow. He took it from a man who had worn it poorly. Still, the optics of the situation, one cousin killing another and assuming the throne, make for uneasy history. Macbeth became king and, for a while, ruled well. His reign lasted 17 years, and some accounts even suggest it was one of relative stability and justice. But legacy is cruel, and it rarely cares about nuance. When Duncan's son, Malcolm Canmore, returned from exile, he brought with him not just an army, but a narrative. Macbeth the usurper, Macbeth the tyrant. It worked. Macbeth was killed in battle in 1057. Malcolm became king, and later a certain English playwright turned the entire episode into a 5-act tragedy with witches and blood-stained hands. Duncan, in truth, was not the innocent lamb Shakespeare portrayed, nor was Macbeth a mere butcher. But once your story becomes a metaphor, your real life gets buried. And speaking of emperors who got buried by their own household, our next ruler drank tea laced with ambition, served by his wife and daughter. And unlike Macbeth, he never even saw the rebellion coming. Emperor Zhongzong. In the imperial courts of Tang Dynasty China, a cup of tea could carry more weight than a blade. For Emperor Zhongzong, that tea was poured by 2 women who loved him, his wife and his daughter. And according to the records, they may have loved power just a little bit more. Zhongzong's reign wasn't linear, it was an exercise in interruption. First installed as emperor in 684, he quickly learned that the throne of China could be pulled out from under you as easily as it was handed over. That lesson came courtesy of his mother, Wu Zetian, the only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor in her own right. She deposed her own son when he showed signs of independence and ruled the empire herself. Years later, when she finally stepped down, Zhongzong was restored to the throne. This time, he ruled not as a figurehead, but with full imperial power, or so it seemed. His second reign began in 705 and looked promising. but almost immediately he leaned heavily on his wife, Empress Wei. She was politically savvy and ambitious, a combination that had already rewritten Chinese history through his mother. Empress Wei, however, was not content with influence. She wanted legacy, she wanted control, and she saw an opportunity through her daughter, Princess Anlei. Princess Anlei was cut from the same silk as her mother, sharp, ambitious, and deeply involved in palace intrigues. Her goal? To become crown princess. Not queen consort, not empress, crown princess. In other words, she wanted to inherit the throne directly, bypassing tradition, succession, and probably a few cousins along the way. Zhongzong, for all his authority, became increasingly passive. He issued decrees, but the court knew the real power was elsewhere, being poured into ears, passed through family banquets, and whispered between Empress Wei and Princess Anlei. Then, in 710, the emperor suddenly died. Officially, it was a stroke, but contemporary sources, many of them unfriendly to Empress Wei, claim otherwise. They say he was poisoned, slowly and deliberately, so that Empress Wei could install a puppet ruler, her son. She would rule as regent, and Princess Anlei, she would become the next Wu Zetian. The plan almost worked, but the rest of the royal family, alarmed by the eerie resemblance to earlier palace takeovers, acted quickly. Within weeks, a coup deposed Empress Wei and killed Princess Anlei. The Shadow Dynasty fell before it could rise. What remains is the mystery of Zhongzong's death. Was he truly poisoned? Did he know what was happening and choose not to act? Did he trust his wife and daughter so deeply that betrayal didn't even register? No answers. Just a tea ceremony, an untimely death, and two women who reached for power, the only way the court ever allowed through silence, subtlety, and allegedly, seduction. And if you think the story ends in scandal, wait until you hear what happens when an emperor's uncle decides that being regent isn't enough and that blood is just one more formality to wash off the throne. Emperor Shao. In 424 AD, the Liu-Song dynasty produced an emperor so unprepared for the throne that his reign barely had time to clear its throat before being silenced by family, of course. Because in early imperial China, bloodlines were power lines, and the quickest way to plug in was to cut someone else out. Emperor Shao, born Liu Yifu, was 17 when he took the throne. His father, Emperor Wu, had forged a powerful dynasty out of rebellion and charisma, but charisma doesn't pass genetically. Shao's early days as emperor were marked by indulgence, disinterest, and a dangerous lack of awareness about how fast the court could shift from praise to paranoia. He spent lavishly. He neglected state affairs. He trusted his favorites. He alienated his ministers. And while none of these traits were especially rare among young monarchs, the issue wasn't what he did, it was who was watching. That would be his uncle, Liu Yilong. Liu Yilong was calm, calculated, and already experienced in statecraft. Where Shao was impulsive, Yilong was methodical. Where Shao surrounded himself with flatterers, Yilong watched from a distance and took notes. He didn't just see an emperor failing, he saw an opportunity. Within a year, the court had turned. Senior ministers, many of whom had served Emperor Wu, agreed that Liu Yifu wasn't just immature, he was dangerous to the dynasty's future. And so, with careful orchestration and a conveniently worded petition, they asked Liu Yilong to take action. What happened next was labeled a transition, a quiet transfer of power. But in truth, it was a coup dressed in Confucian clothing. Liu Yifu was deposed and placed under house arrest, formally still a prince, informally a liability. Not long after, he died. Official records attribute his death to illness. Modern historians suggest something else. Was he assassinated on the orders of Liu Yilong? Did a loyalist try to prevent a counter-coup and preemptively eliminate him? Or did the new emperor simply allow nature or fear to finish the job? Whatever the cause, Liu Yilong became Emperor Wen of Liu Song, one of the most stable and respected rulers of his era. His reign brought consolidation, reform, and relative peace. And as is so often the case, that stability was paid for in the coin of family sacrifice. Emperor Shao is barely remembered. No grand tomb, no romanticized legacy, just a name on a list and a cautionary tale. In dynastic China, youth was never a shield, and uncles were rarely just uncles. Next comes another heir whose uncle didn't stop at political maneuvering. He climbed straight to the throne by removing the one boy in his way, no matter how royal the blood or sacred the crown. Emperor Qianfei. If emperors were judged by how long they stayed alive rather than how well they ruled, then Liu Ziye, known to history as Emperor Qianfei, might still be remembered with sympathy. Unfortunately, the only thing he managed to reign over was chaos, and not even for a full year. Qianfei became emperor of the Liu Song dynasty in 464, at the age of 17. He was the son of Emperor Xiao Wu, whose own reign had been turbulent but survivable. His son, however, came to power already burning bridges and ignoring breaks. From the moment Liu Ziye took the throne, he governed with a kind of paranoid arrogance that made even his father's most troublesome moments seem measured by comparison. He lashed out at his court. He distrusted his ministers. He treated his relatives as enemies in waiting, which, of course, made them become exactly that. There's something uniquely tragic about paranoia in young rulers, because they haven't yet learned which shadows are real. They just see movement and attack. Qianfei's brief reign became infamous for its personal cruelty, rash decisions, and refusal to follow advice. He alienated the court so thoroughly that, by the end of the year, the imperial palace was less a seat of power and more a prison surrounded by well-dressed conspirators. The most dangerous of them was his uncle, Liu Yu. Liu Yu, the prince of Shandong, had kept his distance at least publicly, while Qianfei self-destructed. He didn't challenge the emperor openly. He didn't need to. He just waited. The emperor's behavior made the argument for him. Eventually, the guards themselves stopped seeing Qianfei as the ruler and began looking elsewhere for authority. In 465, Qianfei was assassinated in his own palace. The official story is vague, of course. The order, everyone agrees, came from Liu Yu, who quickly assumed the throne under the name Emperor Ming. With his nephew gone, Liu Yu began what would be remembered as a competent, if conservative, reign. He restored a degree of order, restructured parts of the government, and most tellingly, erased Qianfei's legacy. The young emperor's reign was posthumously condemned as chaotic and morally corrupt. But here's the question. Was Qianfei truly unfit to rule? Or was he simply too young, too isolated, and too trapped in a web of expectations and suspicion to survive? Did he earn his enemies or inherit them? Because in this dynasty, uncles didn't wait for ears to grow into kings. They acted early, and they acted permanently. And speaking of kings cut down before their rule could even find its footing, our next heir ruled for just 3 years before being swallowed by a family coup, the kind of quiet storm where honor and affection become just words, whispered before execution. Danzhong. In the royal court of Joseon, Korea, silence could be more dangerous than any blade. Danjong, the sixth king of the dynasty, learned this lesson with heartbreaking finality, crowned at 12, dead by 17, and betrayed by the very uncle who once promised to protect him. Danjong's story begins in 1452, when he ascended the throne after the death of his father, King Munjong. At the time, the boy king was hardly more than a ceremonial figure. Real power resided in court, officials and regents, mostly those loyal to the legacy of the late king. Enter Grand Prince Su Yang, Danjong's uncle. Su Yang was ambitious, shrewd, and, above all, patient. He watched as the court fragmented into competing factions, all while the boy on the throne smiled politely and signed what he was told to sign. The child king didn't understand the storm brewing beneath his silk shoes. Over the next 2 years, Su Yang built a power base of loyal scholars and military officials who believed the kingdom needed strong leadership, not a figurehead guarded by rival regents. He framed his campaign as one of restoration and stability, but what he restored was himself. In 1455, Su Yang forced Danjong to abdicate, taking the throne as King Seijo. Officially, it was a peaceful transfer out of concern for the kingdom's future. In reality, it was a soft coup draped in Confucian etiquette. At first, Danjong was allowed to live. He was demoted to prince and exiled to a distant province. It was the kind of half-punishment that looks merciful on paper. But mercy has a short shelf life in dynasties, where a former king still draws sympathy. In 1457, a small group of loyal officials attempted to restore Danjong to the throne. The plot failed. The conspirators were executed. And the message was clear. Even whispers of resistance would be met with silence. The permanent kind. Soon after, Danjong was put to death. The official justification? Treasonous plots in his name, but no one really believed he orchestrated anything. He was a teenager in exile. His only real crime was being a symbol one too dangerous to be left alive. King Seijo ruled for another 13 years, consolidating his authority and implementing legal reforms. He's often remembered as an effective monarch, but his reign began with the quiet execution of a boy who trusted him, and no amount of bureaucratic brilliance can entirely erase that stain. Danjong's tomb was marked with reverence centuries later. He was posthumously restored to royal status, honored as a tragic figure, a child swallowed by politics, reduced to a footnote by a man who called himself family. But in royal histories, footnotes have long shadows. And in ancient Persia, one such shadow wore a crown for only a few weeks, before his own brother turned the family tree into a battlefield and blood into succession paperwork. Xerxes too. In the Achaemenid Empire, royal succession wasn't just a matter of blood, it was a matter of velocity. As in, how fast can you sit on the throne before someone else stabs the chair out from under you? For Xerxes too, the answer was about 45 days. That's not a metaphor. The man ruled Persia for less than 2 months before his half-brother, Sogdianus, ended both his reign and his relevance in one decisive act of family politics. The ancient sources are sparse, conflicting, and soaked in royal propaganda, but what they do agree on is this: Xerxes too never had a chance. He was the legitimate son of Artaxerxes I, who ruled Persia for over 4 decades, a reign long enough to produce both an empire and a long line of rivals. When Artaxerxes died around 424 BCE, Xerxes II was quickly declared king. The idea was to secure the transition, keep the palace steady, and show the empire that the throne was still warm. But there was a problem. 2 of them, actually. Enter Sogdianus and Ochus. Both were sons of Artaxerxes, born to different concubines. and both believed they had just as much right to the crown as Xerxes. In most families, this would be a subject for passive-aggressive dinner conversations. In the Achaemenid dynasty, it was civil war. Sogdianus acted first. Depending on which Greek historian you believe, he either had Xerxes assassinated during a private moment of vulnerability, or he launched a surprise coup that ended with his brother quietly eliminated. Either way, Xerxes disappeared from the record almost as quickly as he entered it. Sogdianus declared himself king. He had power, he had momentum, and for a few months he had no one openly contesting him. Until Ochus did. Ochus was the satrap of Hyrcania, a powerful governor with military backing and a very personal interest in correcting what he saw as two mistakes: Xerxes' brief reign and Sogdianus' current one. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For a brief window in Persian history, Sogdianus was king. He'd outmaneuvered his brother, taken the throne, and silenced one rival. Only one. Because the empire still had another prince sharpening his ambition on the map of Persia, and this time he wasn't going to wait 45 days to make his move. Sogdianus. If you blinked during Sogdianus' reign, you missed it. After assassinating his half-brother Xerxes II and seizing the Achaemenid throne, Sogdianus ruled Persia for a grand total of 6 months, which, in fairness, is 5 months longer than Xerxes. But when the bar is outlive the sibling you just betrayed, victory tends to feel hollow. At first glance, Sogdianus looked like he had it figured out. He acted fast, seized the throne while the court was still disoriented from Artaxerxes I's death, and declared his right to rule with all the pomp and scribal legitimacy he could muster. He even secured the capital and installed allies in key places. But speed isn't the same as strategy, and Sogdianus had overlooked one very large, very dangerous brother, Ochus. Ochus, unlike the others, didn't rely on surprise. He took a slower, more methodical route to the throne. First, he secured the loyalty of several provinces. Then, he began assembling an army. He didn't waste time arguing about legitimacy. He simply moved. And here's the twist: he didn't claim the throne immediately. He waited. He let Sogdianus burn through his political capital, alienate the nobles, and fumble his brief shot at emperorship. Then he struck. By the time Ochus marched on Sogdianus, he had the military edge and, more importantly, the narrative. Sogdianus wasn't just a usurper, he was an ineffective usurper. The court, weary from the whiplash of 2 coronations and 1 assassination, was ready for someone who looked like a real king. Ochus defeated Sogdianus and captured him. The punishment was swift and, according to Greek historians, symbolic. Depending on the account, Sogdianus was either smothered in ash or suffocated in a way that honored a prior oath not to be killed by the sword or fire. Ancient Persian diplomacy, apparently, had its poetic side. Ochus ascended to the throne as Darius II. His reign would last nearly 2 decades, marked by palace intrigue, foreign entanglements, and the slow unraveling of centralized power. But before all that, he made one thing abundantly clear. Brothers were rivals, and rivals were expendable. Sogdianus, like Xerxes II before him, vanished from royal memory. No monuments, no heroic elegies, just a short, bitter footnote in an empire that rarely forgave failure and never tolerated second place. And just when you think royal poisonings couldn't get more personal, our next ruler trusted his wife to pour the wine only to discover that she was playing an entirely different endgame. One where the last toast was for his memory. Antiochus II Theos. In the Seleucid Empire, diplomacy came with a dowry. and every marriage was just a truce on a ticking clock. No one understood this better or suffered more from it than Antiochus II Theos, a king whose name meant God, but whose fate looked more like a soap opera with body counts. Ruling from 261 to 246 BCE, Antiochus II inherited more than just his father's kingdom. He inherited the mess of a crumbling empire sandwiched between collapsing loyalties and ambitious former allies. The Seleucid dynasty, built from the remains of Alexander the Great's empire, was constantly at war externally with Ptolemaic Egypt and internally with itself. To ease tensions with Egypt, Antiochus made what appeared to be a rational move. He divorced his first wife, Laodice I, and married Berenice, daughter of Ptolemy II of Egypt. Peace by matrimony, a familiar and temporary solution in the ancient world, a wedding ring instead of a war. But Laodice wasn't just any ex-empress. She was politically powerful, well-connected, and absolutely not the kind of woman you send off with a farewell fruit basket and a polite pension. For a few years, the arrangement held. Antiochus ruled with Berenice, fathered a son by her, and tried to keep both households from turning the court into a civil war brunch. Then Ptolemy II died, and that changed everything. Without her father to protect her, Berenice's political leverage collapsed. Antiochus, perhaps sensing the wind shifting or simply falling back into old habits, left her and returned to Laodice. It was a stunning reversal, and one that made little sense unless you understood the level of pressure he was under. Court factions loyal to Laodice had been simmering for years, and Antiochus may have believed he could keep both his throne and his head by reuniting with her. He was half right. Shortly after reconciling with Laodice, Antiochus died. The official story is vague, but most ancient sources, Greek, Roman, and others, imply foul play. The likely suspect? Laodice. Poison is the favorite theory. The motive? Unmistakable. By eliminating Antiochus, she cleared the path for her own son, Seleucus II, to inherit the throne, cutting off Berenice's claim entirely. Berenice, not one to quietly disappear, tried to protect her son's right to rule. But her efforts were cut short. Some say she was assassinated in a coup led by Laodice's faction. Others believe she was simply politically crushed. Either way, both women fought a battle Antiochus never truly understood. He wasn't just betrayed. He was outmaneuvered in a family feud that dressed itself as dynastic politics but played out like a tragedy. And if you think Laodice's ambitions ended there, wait until you meet her daughter-in-law, the next queen, who didn't just murder a king, but did so with maternal conviction and a sharp eye for inheritance law. Seleucus v. Philometor. There are bad sons, there are ambitious mothers, and then there's Cleopatra Thea, queen, widow, and eventual executioner of her own child. Her son, Seleucus v. Philometor, barely had time to settle into the Seleucid throne before realizing that Mom wasn't going to be content ruling behind the curtain. Let's rewind. By the time Seleucus V came to power in 125 BCE, the Seleucus Empire was a hollowed-out shell of its former self. What had once been a sprawling dominion from the Aegean to the Indus was now a chaotic assortment of warring cities and scheming generals. Seleucus V inherited the throne after the death of his father, Demetrius II Nicator, or rather, he claimed it. The problem? Cleopatra Thea didn't think he was ready. And by not ready, she meant not obedient. She had just survived decades of palace intrigue, 2 royal husbands, multiple civil wars, and a political marriage to the Ptolemaic dynasty. She wasn't going to let her son ruin it all by being independently minded. Seleucus V made the rookie mistake of trying to rule without her. He tried to assert authority, made appointments she didn't approve of, and reportedly ignored her counsel. In a functioning dynasty, this would be a standard succession drama. In the Seleucid court, it was a prelude to disaster. The exact events are murky, but all roads lead to one conclusion. Cleopatra Thea had her son killed. Why? Possibly because he was too impulsive. Possibly because he was about to provoke yet another war. Or maybe, just maybe, because she preferred her other son, Antiochus VIII, to be on the throne instead, someone she believed she could mold more easily. And so, Seleucus V joined the long list of rulers erased not by foreign invaders, not by traitorous generals, but by their own mothers. Cleopatra Thea didn't even blink. She installed Antiochus VIII as king, ruled as co-regent, and continued playing chess with the fragments of the empire for a few more turbulent years. Eventually, of course, that game caught up with her too. Poisoned, assassinated, or simply outplayed her end, like her reign, is still debated. But what's not debated is this. The Seleucid throne was the deadliest piece of furniture in the ancient world, and Cleopatra Thea was one of the few who knew how to sit on it without flinching. And if you're keeping track, that's 2 royal deaths at her hand so far. Because next up is the queen who raised an emperor, ruled alongside him, and when he got in her way, added him to her legacy, with the cold efficiency only a mother could perfect. Cleopatra 3. Cleopatra III was not a woman who waited for history to remember her kindly. She carved her place into it with a steady hand and a ruthless gaze. As a queen of the Ptolemaic dynasty, her life was a storm of betrayals, co-regencies, palace feuds, and political murders. She was a mother, a monarch, and a master manipulator in an era when all 3 jobs came with knives hidden in the ceremonial robes. She ruled Egypt alongside her husband and uncle, Ptolemy VIII. It was a volatile relationship, equal parts alliance and civil war. The Ptolemies, after all, were known for their strange talent of marrying close relatives and murdering even closer ones. And Cleopatra III, she leaned into both traditions. After Ptolemy VIII's death, Cleopatra III didn't mourn, she maneuvered. She placed herself as co-ruler with her son Ptolemy IX, a safe enough move at first glance. But, as with all things in the Ptolemaic court, safe was never permanent. Soon, Cleopatra III began to see her eldest son not as an heir, but as a threat. Ptolemy IX had his own ideas, his own advisors, and perhaps worst of all, his own popularity among certain Egyptian factions. Cleopatra responded by pushing him aside and elevating her younger son, Ptolemy X, to the throne alongside her instead. If this sounds like a family dinner gone wildly out of control, that's because it was. The family tensions snapped into open conflict. Cleopatra III had essentially fired one son and replaced him with another, which predictably ignited civil unrest. But Cleopatra wasn't interested in what the public thought. She was managing an empire and managing her legacy. Her new co-regent, Ptolemy X, seemed more pliable. He owed his throne to her, and she intended to keep it that way. But Ptolemaic Egypt was a place where gratitude lasted about as long as the Nile floodwaters. And Ptolemy X, perhaps realizing that his mother had already disposed of one brother and wouldn't hesitate to do the same to him, acted first. In 101 BCE, Cleopatra III was murdered. The person behind it? Her son, Ptolemy X. Historians disagree on the details, as always. Some say it was a coup. Others claim it was a preemptive strike before she could replace him with yet another heir. What no one disputes is that the act ended her reign and opened yet another chapter in the bloody Ptolemaic succession saga. She was buried with all the pomp due an Egyptian queen. But legacy isn't defined by tombs. Cleopatra III is remembered as a monarch who ruled through her sons until they could no longer breathe under her shadow. And speaking of Ptolemies who turned murder into a family tradition, the next royal on our list was both husband and stepson to his victim, and managed to end a dynasty with a single act of dynastic ambition disguised as marriage: Berenice III. By the time Berenice III came to power, the Ptolemaic dynasty was less a family than a circular firing squad. She was the daughter of Cleopatra Selene and Ptolemy the IX, and her reign, brief, tragic, and suspiciously well-timed, was bookended by betrayal. And not just political betrayal, but the kind that sends historians scrambling for family trees and asking, wait, they were what to each other? Berenice ruled Egypt for 6 months in 81 BCE after the death of her father, Ptolemy IX. The court was exhausted. The people, more so. The Ptolemaic dynasty had become an endless loop of succession crises, sibling rivalries, and regents with more blood on their hands than tax reform. But for a moment, Berenice looked like a break in the chaos. She was smart, popular, capable, and for once, the people of Egypt seemed cautiously optimistic. A female monarch wasn't new. This was the dynasty that would eventually produce Cleopatra VII. After all, but Berenice brought a sense of calm authority. For about 5 minutes, enter Ptolemy XI. He was the son of Ptolemy X. Yes, the one who killed Cleopatra III. After the death of Ptolemy IX, the Roman Senate, yes, Rome was already poking its nose into Egyptian politics, arranged for Ptolemy XI to return from exile and marry Berenice III. They were, by most accounts, stepmother and stepson, possibly half-siblings, depending on which royal rumour mill you subscribe to. Either way, the marriage was less romantic and more statecraft on a deadline. The people weren't thrilled, but they tolerated it. Until 10 days later, Ptolemy XI murdered Berenice. No trial, no accusations, just a queen gone. The official reason? Unclear. Possibly to consolidate power. Possibly out of fear she would move against him first. Or maybe he just thought he could rule alone without her. He was wrong. The murder triggered immediate outrage. Berenice had been beloved, and the public response was swift. The Alexandrian mob rose up and killed Ptolemy XI in what can only be described as the one moment of justice in a dynasty built on family betrayal. 2 monarchs, 10 days, 1 shared tomb. What remains of Berenice III is not just a brief reign, but a symbol of what the Ptolemies could have been if they had spent more time governing and less time eliminating one another. And if you think that's dramatic, our next king didn't just get betrayed by his queen, he got double-crossed by her and their son. Because in ancient Parthia, family loyalty was just a hallway you passed through on your way to the throne room. Phraates 3. In the Parthian Empire, where kings were often surrounded by relatives with sharper ambitions than swords, Phraates IV thought he had everything under control. After all, he'd already killed off most of his brothers to secure the throne standard practice for a new king in that era. He had survived palace conspiracies, defeated Roman invaders, and even outlived several assassination attempts. By all appearances, he was one of those hardened rulers built to weather any storm. Except the storm came from within his own house. Phraates IV reigned from around 37 to 2 BCE and spent most of his time on the throne defending his empire from the Romans, from rebellious satraps, and eventually from his own family. He wasn't loved, but he was respected, mostly because people knew better than to cross him. His rule was marked by severe decisions and strategic marriages, including one with an Italian slave turned queen named Musa. Musa, Gifted to Phraates by the Roman Emperor Augustus as part of a peace negotiation, quickly became a central figure in the Parthian court. She wasn't just beautiful and clever, she was also extraordinarily ambitious. Within a few years, she had gained Phraates IV's trust, then his favor, then his throne room. She gave him a son, Phraates V, nicknamed Phraates's. This child would eventually become both the symbol of her success and the instrument of her final betrayal. As Phraates IV aged, Musa convinced him to send his older sons, those from previous wives, to Rome. Officially, this was framed as a diplomatic gesture, a peace offering to keep Parthia and Rome on good terms. Unofficially, it was a preemptive power move. With the older sons gone, Phraates V was left as the heir apparent. Then came the final act. Around 2 BCE, Phraates IV suddenly died. No fanfare, no elaborate battle, no heroic last stand. Just gone. And almost immediately, Musa and her son assumed power as co-rulers. The official records say little. The unofficial consensus is clear. Musa poisoned him. Together, Musa and Phraates V ruled briefly, an unusual mother-son co-regency in a kingdom that had never seen such a dynamic before. But Parthian nobles were less interested in innovation and more in survival. They didn't trust the Roman-born queen. They didn't like the whispers of incestuous ambition between her and her son. And they certainly didn't forget how conveniently the old king had disappeared. By 4 CE, both Musa and Phraates V were deposed, exiled, and erased from official memory. Phraates IV's death is remembered less for how he ruled than for who betrayed him. He had defeated Romans, crushed rebellions, and navigated decades of instability. But he failed to see that his biggest threat wasn't outside the palace, it was serving him tea and calling him my king. And now we cross the seas to a kingdom lush and ancient, where a devout and disciplined ruler built reservoirs and temples, only to be buried alive by the same son who once bowed to him. Datusena. Sri Lanka's ancient Anuradhapura kingdom was a place of quiet resilience. It valued irrigation over invasion, stone over sword, and the sacred order of kingship above all. King Datusena, who reigned in the 5th century, embodied all of these ideals. A builder king, a Buddhist patron, and a ruler remembered for his engineering brilliance, Datusena should have ended his reign as a revered ancestor. Instead, he ended it face to face with the son who orchestrated his downfall. Datusena came to power during a turbulent time. The island was recovering from invasions by South Indian forces, and the kingdom was fractured. With methodical care, Datusena rebuilt not just the infrastructure, but the spirit of the realm. His most famous project was the Kala Wewa, a vast reservoir and irrigation system still functional today. Water, in this ancient society, was more powerful than gold, and Datusena knew how to wield it. But beneath the calm surface of the kingdom ran a quiet familial rift. Kassapa, his son by a non-royal consort, feared being passed over for succession in favor of his younger half-brother, Moggallana, who had a stronger maternal lineage. Royal legitimacy in Anuradhapura wasn't just about blood. It was about optics, who your mother was, how the nobles saw you, and whether your ascension looked like divine order or palace politics. Kassapa chose not to wait. He staged a coup in 459 CE, supported by a faction of the military and some disillusioned nobles. Moggallana fled the island to seek refuge in India. Datusena was captured and imprisoned by his own son. The kingdom he built now ruled by someone who still called him father. At first, Kassapa tried to maintain the illusion of filial respect. He allowed Datusena to live under guard, stripped of power but not executed. It was likely a move to placate the public, who still held the former king in high regard. But it didn't last. At some point, Kassapa demanded to know the location of his father's hidden treasures. Datusena, perhaps tired of humiliation, or perhaps making a final symbolic gesture, led him to the great Kalawewa reservoir. Standing before the massive body of water he had created, the king reportedly said, "This is all I possess. This is my treasure." Kassapa, unmoved, ordered his death. Some accounts say Datusena was entombed alive in a wall. Others say he was quietly executed. The method is debated. The message is not. Kassapa ruled for years afterward, building the famous rock fortress of Sigiriya, an architectural marvel that stood as both a palace and a fortress. But even in stone, he couldn't escape the shadows of patricide. His half-brother Mogalana returned years later, overthrew him, and restored the dynasty's moral equilibrium, at least on the surface. Datusena is remembered not just for how he died, but for what he left behind: water, stone, and the enduring echo of a father betrayed not by an enemy, but by his own ambition-bearing son. And next, we head to the wind-swept heart of Central Asia, where one of the most brilliant astronomers of the medieval world was beheaded not by religious fanatics or foreign invaders, but by the son he had once hoped would continue his vision: Ulugh Beg. Timur the Lame built an empire with swords. His grandson, Ulugh Beg, tried to build one with stars. In the 15th century, Central Asia was no stranger to warlords, dynastic intrigue, and shifting power. But Ulugh Beg, ruler of the Timurid Empire's heartland, was a different kind of sovereign. He preferred equations to executions. While other rulers calculated taxes, he calculated planetary orbits. In a world defined by conquest, he was defined by curiosity. Ruling from the city of Samarkand, a cultural jewel of the Islamic Golden Age, Ulugh Beg transformed it into a hub of scientific discovery. He founded a madrasa that attracted some of the greatest minds of the age. His observatory, the largest of its kind in the Islamic world at the time, was so precise that his astronomical tables would remain unmatched for centuries. He wasn't just a king who funded scholars, he was one. He taught classes, debated theology and science, memorized entire mathematical treatises. Ulugh Beg dreamed of ruling an empire not with fear, but with reason. But in doing so, he made one grave miscalculation. He assumed his son shared that dream. Abd al-Latif, his son, had been raised in the court's shadow, surrounded by books and scholars, but not warmth. He saw his father's obsession with knowledge not as a virtue, but as a failure of leadership. The empire was crumbling, military commanders were disloyal, rivals circled like vultures. And Ulugh Beg, brilliant though he was, seemed unwilling or unable to confront the political decay. Abd al-Latif saw what needed to be done, and he did it. In 1449, amidst growing unrest and political fracture, Ulugh Beg was deposed by his own son. What followed wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a palace siege. It was bureaucratic, quiet, and fatal. Ulugh Beg was captured and executed, some say with a whisper of regret from the man who gave the order. Others say with chilling efficiency. The great astronomer king died not on the battlefield, but in chains, his instruments shattered, his observatory desecrated, and his son on the throne. Abd al-Latif ruled briefly. His reign was marked not by learning, but by paranoia and violence. He died mysteriously within 2 years, some say poisoned, some say assassinated, others say broken by the very weight of the crown he seized. Ulugh Beg's legacy, however, survived. Centuries later, European astronomers would rediscover his data and marvel at its accuracy. The observatory was unearthed in the 20th century, a ruined monument to a man centuries ahead of his time. He charted the stars with unmatched precision. He just didn't see the knife coming from his own blood. And if that sounds tragic, wait until you meet the Mughal emperor who trusted his nephew, ignored the signs, and found out that royal uncles are just as expendable as fathers, especially when the throne is only one assassination away. Jahandar Shah. Jahandar Shah's reign in the Mughal Empire was a footnote even while it was happening. In 1712, after the death of Emperor Bahadur Shah I, a brutal war of succession erupted among his sons. Jahandar Shah emerged victorious not because he was the most competent or beloved, but because he survived long enough to sit on the throne. For a brief, chaotic moment, he ruled an empire unraveling faster than anyone could repair it. He was indulgent, erratic, and more interested in court entertainments than court stability. His most famous decision was elevating a low-born courtesan, Lal Kunwar, to the position of queen consort, something that scandalized the nobility and alienated the already fragile elite. More importantly, it gave his rivals all the ammunition they needed to claim he was unfit for rule. One of those rivals was his nephew and son-in-law Farrukhsiyar. Farrukhsiyar was ambitious, calculating, and had something Jahandar Shah no longer did: momentum. Backed by the powerful Said brothers, kingmakers of the empire, Farrukhsiyar launched a rebellion in 1713. Jahandar, confident in his own authority, underestimated the speed and decisiveness of the attack. He fled the capital, but his forces quickly collapsed. He was captured, dragged before the victors, and imprisoned. The throne passed to Farrukhsiyar within weeks. Officially, the transition was described as necessary. Unofficially, it was a clean, quiet coup, disguised as dynastic course correction. Jahandar Shah, no longer emperor, was soon executed in secret. The order came from Farrukhsiyar, possibly at the urging of the Said brothers, who feared leaving any surviving claimants alive. There was no trial, no outcry. The empire moved on as if he had never reigned. Farrukhsiyar would enjoy a few years of shaky rule, constantly under the thumb of the same men who helped install him. Eventually, they turned on him too, because loyalty in the Mughal court was just another form of waiting for your turn. Jahandar Shah left behind no great monuments, no sweeping reforms, no golden age. Just a cautionary tale that winning a civil war doesn't mean you've won the empire. And blood ties, whether as uncle, brother, or father-in-law, meant absolutely nothing once the throne was involved. Because in the Mughal palace, everyone was family, and everyone was replaceable. Just ask the king whose nephew didn't just replace him but walked right into the palace with a gun. King Faisal. It's one thing to be betrayed by an enemy, another entirely to be betrayed by someone who shared your name, your lineage, your royal blood. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia knew both sides of power, its ability to transform nations, and its uncanny talent for attracting bullets from within the family tree. Faisal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud didn't begin his reign with a parade. He took the throne in 1964 after ousting his half-brother, King Saud, in a power struggle that was anything but ceremonial. From the start, Faisal saw himself not as a ruler of tradition, but as a reformer wrapped in robes of old prestige. He modernized Saudi Arabia's bureaucracy, balanced its budget, and introduced cautious but impactful changes to education and women's rights moves that won him international praise and domestic enemies. But what he's most remembered for, at least outside the kingdom, was his oil diplomacy. After the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Faisal led an oil embargo against the West in retaliation for support of Israel, which caused a global energy crisis. The gesture made him an icon in parts of the Arab world, a villain in others, and a symbol of strategic defiance in the global power game. But no king navigates reform without angering those who believe the old ways were better. Faisal walked a tightrope between progress and tradition, between global politics and internal unrest. He was revered by many, respected by most, and quietly resented by a few. One of those few was his nephew, Prince Faisal bin Musaid. The prince had a complicated relationship with the royal family. Educated in the United States, he returned to Saudi Arabia, disillusioned, politically agitated, and increasingly isolated. His motivations remain shrouded in speculation. Some say it was ideological. Others point to personal grievances, family tensions, or mental health struggles. Perhaps it was all of these, perhaps none. On the 25th of March, 1975, during what was supposed to be a routine greeting, Prince Faisal approached his uncle during a majlis, a public audience with the king. The setting was informal, ceremonial, familial. The prince pulled out a gun and fired. The king collapsed. Guards seized the assassin, but the damage was done. Saudi Arabia entered immediate mourning. The kingdom's unifier and reformer was gone in an instant, not in war, not in rebellion, but in an intimate, calculated moment from within the family. Prince Faisal was quickly tried and executed, and the royal family moved to stabilize the country with Prince Khalid assuming the throne. The state narrative closed the book fast, too fast. But the questions remained. Was the act political, personal, a mix of both? What's most haunting isn't the ambiguity, it's the symmetry. A king who modernized his kingdom, met by a bullet from someone raised in the world he helped shape. And if that sounds like the darkest possible family betrayal, think again, because our next ruler wasn't killed for politics or policy, but for power in its rawest, oldest form. And his assassins weren't nephews or sons-in-law. They were brothers, Shaka Zulu. There are few figures in African history as mythic, as formidable, or as divisive as Shaka Zulu. Born in the late 18th century and rising to power in the early 19th, Shaka transformed the Zulu clan from a minor tribe into a military superpower. Through relentless warfare, brutal discipline, and revolutionary military tactics, he created an empire that stretched across much of southern Africa. He wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature. But nature, as it turns out, has siblings too. Shaka's rise began with blood, his own and others. The illegitimate son of Senzanga Kona, he was cast out as a child along with his mother, Nandi. He grew up among rival tribes, learning survival, strategy, and the subtle art of waiting. Eventually, he returned to the Zulu and rose through the ranks under Chief Dingiswayo of the Mnithwa Confederacy. When his father died, Shaka took the Zulu throne and began reshaping it in his own image. What followed was a reign of intense centralization and militarization. Shaka abolished age-old customs and introduced new ones. He restructured the army, introduced the short-stabbing spear, Eftha, and emphasized close combat tactics that forever changed regional warfare. He didn't just conquer, he absorbed, reshaped, and redefined. But power is its own contagion. Shaka's later years were marked by paranoia and cruelty, particularly after the death of his mother. He ordered elaborate mourning rituals, punished perceived disloyalty harshly, and demanded absolute loyalty from every chieftain, general, and relative. His half-brothers, Dingani and Mlangana, watched this carefully. They had been close, once brothers in title and blood, raised within the same storms of tradition and tribal politics. But Shaka had outgrown brotherhood. He ruled alone, and anyone close to him was either a tool or a threat. In 1828, the brothers made their move. While Shaka was away from his regiments unusually vulnerable, they confronted him. According to oral tradition, Shaka greeted them calmly, perhaps even with familiarity. There was no army surrounding him, no shield wall, just family. And then, there wasn't. After Shaka's death, Dingane took the throne. He would rule for over a decade, trying to balance the kingdom between legacy and rebellion, foreign threats and internal unrest. But the shadow of Shaka loomed large, not just in memory, but in method. No one ruled the Zulu kingdom again without knowing that kingship came at the price of brotherhood. Shaka wasn't killed in battle. He wasn't overthrown by foreign invaders or betrayed by distant relatives. He was taken down by those who had shared his blood and his roof. Because in dynasties built on strength, the line between brother and rival disappears fast, and when it does, the crown is just another inheritance to fight over. And next, we travel even farther back in time to ancient Egypt, where a pharaoh's downfall wasn't the result of conquest or cosmic fate, but a whisper in a harem, and a plan set in motion by the ones he called family. Ramesses III, the last great pharaoh of Egypt's new kingdom, wasn't brought down by invaders or uprisings, but by a quiet conspiracy within the palace walls, one that played out not in open revolt, but in bedrooms, courtyards, and whispers. Ramesses III ruled in the 12th century BCE, a king who fought back against foreign powers, preserved the borders of a declining empire, and maintained the ceremonial grandeur of a state already rotting from within. His reign was long, over 3 decades of war and ritual and bureaucratic endurance. He battled the sea peoples, built extravagant temples, and upheld the legacy of the 20th dynasty with the kind of theatrical devotion that would have made his namesake, Ramesses the Great, at least raise an eyebrow. But while Ramesses III fought external threats, he failed to notice or failed to stop the poison growing at home. The trouble began with his household. Like many pharaohs, Ramesses had multiple wives, each with her own children, ambitions, and supporters. His chief wife and her son were meant to inherit. That was the plan. But there was another wife, Queen Tiye, lesser in rank perhaps, but not in ambition. Tiye wanted her son, Pentawere, to be pharaoh. She saw no reason he should be excluded from destiny just because of the formalities of royal hierarchy. And in the ancient Egyptian court, ambition was rarely voiced aloud, but it was often acted upon. What followed became known to history as the harem conspiracy. Tiye, along with palace officials, magicians, and members of the court, orchestrated an assassination attempt to eliminate the king. This wasn't an external coup, it was a family operation. A revolt rooted in the inner chambers of the palace, led by wives, sons, and servants who had everything to gain and nothing left to fear. Ramesses III was attacked in his private quarters. For centuries, no one knew exactly how he died. Ancient trial records indicated a plot and an execution, but the details were shrouded. Then in 2012, modern forensic analysis of his mummy revealed a deep wound across his throat, suggesting the conspiracy had succeeded. His son, Ramesses IV, ascended the throne and quickly initiated trials against the conspirators. Dozens were arrested, many were executed. Others, like Pentawere, were given the option of taking their own lives, a euphemism in the trial texts for forced suicide. Even in judgment, the palace preferred its euphemisms. Ramesses III's legacy is complex. He was the last pharaoh to wield real power. His monuments still stand. His wars still echo in temple walls. But his end was not carved in stone, it was whispered in corridors, plotted by those closest to him, and sealed by the ambition of a son who believed the crown was just a conversation away. And speaking of royal ends that come wrapped in ceremonial robes and betrayal, the next ruler we meet was born a client king of Rome, a descendant of Cleopatra herself, and executed not by Rome, not by rebellion, but by a cousin with an empire and an ego the size of a continent, Ptolemy of Mauritania. Ptolemy of Mauritania had royal blood flowing through him from all directions, North African, Hellenistic, and Roman. The grandson of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony, he represented the last living link to a world that had once terrified Rome, seduced it, and finally bowed to it. But by the 1st century CE, Ptolemy's realm was no longer a rival to Rome, it was a satellite of it. A client kingdom nestled in North Africa, governed with ceremonial autonomy, and expected to smile graciously every time the emperor sneezed. Ptolemy inherited his throne from his father, Juba II, and ruled Mauritania with quiet loyalty to Rome. He was cultured, refined, and deeply Romanized. He spoke Latin, dressed in togas, minted coins bearing Roman imperial titles, and made no trouble for his overlords. By all accounts, he was the ideal client king, obedient, polished, unthreatening. So naturally, he was killed. The emperor at the time was Caligula, Rome's most infamous theatrical dictator. Caligula was young, unstable, and obsessed with loyalty in the way only deeply insecure autocrats can be. He invited Ptolemy to Rome in 40 CE, allegedly to honor him, possibly to humiliate him, or perhaps just to relieve his own boredom. Ptolemy arrived dressed in regal splendor, his cloak embroidered in gold, his bearing unmistakably royal. He stood out in a city already teeming with power plays and paranoia. According to ancient sources, it was that cloak that doomed him. Caligula, upon seeing his cousin outshine him in his own capital, reportedly muttered, "There must not be more than one king in Rome." Within days, Ptolemy was executed, no trial, no scandal, just another noble buried under imperial insecurity. The official reason? Never clearly stated. But the subtext was obvious. Caligula couldn't bear competition, not even the illusion of it. Even if it came from a cousin who had no armies, no ambitions, and no plans to challenge Roman authority. Ptolemy's death sparked unrest in Mauritania. The region, deprived of its king, erupted in rebellion. Rome responded with typical force, eventually annexing Mauritania and dividing it into provinces. The golden thread of Hellenistic royalty ended not in triumph, but in bureaucratic paperwork. There's something deeply ironic about Ptolemy's fate. He did everything right. He was loyal, respectful, deferential. He bent the knee so far he practically kissed the Senate floor. And yet, his death was not only unnecessary, it was absurd. Because in imperial Rome, your greatest threat wasn't rebellion, it was relevance. And if a gold cloak could provoke a cousin to kill, imagine what happens when a military genius takes the throne, starts reforming the empire, and forgets that his own family isn't watching in admiration, but in anticipation. Nikephoros II, Phocas. In the Byzantine Empire, brilliance was rarely a shield. Sometimes, it just made the knife come faster. Nikephoros II, Phocas was one of Byzantium's greatest generals, a military titan whose campaigns pushed back the Islamic caliphates, reclaimed vast territories in the east, and restored a flicker of imperial glory to an empire that had been slowly bleeding for decades. He was the kind of man whose victories inspired songs, mosaics, and just enough fear to make the court uncomfortable. By 963 CE, after the death of Emperor Romanos II, Nikephoros, already a war hero, was named regent to the young co-emperors, Basil and Constantine. Their mother, the cunning and politically elusive Empress Theophano, saw an opportunity. She supported Nikephoros' rise to power, married him not long after, and turned the warlord into an emperor. What followed was not a fairy tale. Nikephoros ruled like he fought, blunt, austere, and unrelenting. He raised taxes, cut luxuries at court, and filled the imperial treasury through rigid economic discipline. He was a monk in armor, ascetic, humorless, and deeply unpopular with the Byzantine elite. The church distrusted his military austerity. The nobles despised his taxation. Even Theophano, who once saw him as a ticket to power, grew distant. He built walls, literal and figurative. The palace became a fortress. He no longer trusted those around him, and he had good reason not to, because one of the people he did trust was John Tzimiskis, his nephew and former protege, a general like himself, charismatic and politically savvy where Nikephoros was grim and rigid. But Tzimiskis had his own ambitions and, according to most sources, an increasingly close relationship with Theophano. Together, they hatched a plan. On a cold December night in 969, conspirators smuggled themselves into the palace disguised as women, sneaking past guards who had been handpicked by the emperor himself. They found Nikephoros in his chamber, deep in prayer, and killed him reportedly after Theophano had unlocked the doors. Tzimiskis claimed the throne almost immediately. Theophano, however, didn't fare quite as well. She was exiled, possibly because Tzimiskis needed to distance himself from the scandal, possibly because he no longer needed her. Nikephoros died not as a warrior on the battlefield, but as a man betrayed in his own home, by the woman he married and the man he helped raise. Byzantium gained a new emperor and lost a general who might have built an empire. And if you think Byzantine palace plots couldn't get worse, let's take one more step into the imperial archives where a young emperor named Jian Wen thought family bonds could survive a coup. He was wrong. Jian Wen Emperor. History has a special kind of silence reserved for emperors who disappear. The Jian Wen Emperor of the Ming dynasty, born Zhu Yunwen, reigned for just 4 years, from 1398 to 1402. His rule began with idealism and ended with smoke, literally, when his grandfather, the formidable Ming founder Hongwu, died. The throne passed not to one of the seasoned princes of the empire, but to the young and inexperienced Jian Wen. His succession was legal but not universally respected. The problem wasn't his claim, it was his uncle's. Specifically, one uncle, Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan. Zhu Di was a proven military commander, beloved by his troops, stationed in the north to guard against Mongol incursions, and possibly the most dangerous man in China not already sitting on the throne. Jian Wen saw the threat early on and tried to neutralize it. He began a campaign of centralization, stripping his uncles of power, arresting their allies, and curbing regional authority. It worked, for a while. Then Zhu Di rose. In what would later be known as the Jingnan Campaign, Zhu Di launched a rebellion framed not as a bid for the throne, but as a rescue mission, claiming he intended to cleanse the court of evil ministers who were misleading his nephew. Classic move. You don't start a civil war, you start a restoration. Over 3 years of civil war, Jian Wen's forces lost ground. One by one, cities fell, and in 1402, Zhu Di's army stormed Nanjing, the imperial capital. Then the records get fuzzy. The palace burned. Jian Wen vanished. Official documents claimed he died in the fire. But there was no body, no funeral, no final proclamation, just ash, smoke, and a vacuum of certainty. Judy took the throne as the Yongle Emperor and began one of the most celebrated reigns in Chinese history. He moved the capital to Beijing, launched the treasure voyages of Zheng, he rebuilt the Forbidden City, and erased the Jianwen Emperor from history. Literally, a purge followed. Records were destroyed. Officials loyal to Jianwen were executed or exiled. His name was removed from the official list of emperors. He became a ghost in the annals of power. But rumors lingered. Some said Jianwen had escaped in disguise, becoming a wandering monk. Others whispered that loyalists had helped him fake his death and flee the capital. Throughout the Yongle reign, sightings of Jianwen popped up like folklore, each one adding fuel to a myth the emperor tried desperately to extinguish. What makes this mystery so haunting is that it was engineered to be unsolvable. The man who fell from power was erased so thoroughly that even centuries later, historians are still trying to prove he existed. One emperor dies in the fire, the other rules in its light. And next, we travel south to a kingdom in ancient Vietnam, where a crown passed not through generations but over corpses, and a half-brother decided one emperor was all the country needed, Lê Nhan Tông. In the annals of Dai Viet, what is now modern-day Vietnam, few royal deaths cut so sharply into the national conscience as that of Lê Nhan Tông. He was a young emperor with a fragile grip on power, born into a dynasty that was already unraveling at the seams, and taken down not by foreign enemies or peasant revolt, but by a half-brother with a better army and a worse conscience. Born in 1441, Lê Nhan Tông became emperor at the astonishing age of just 1, following the death of his father, Emperor Lê Thai Tông. Naturally, a toddler can't rule an empire, so power fell into the hands of his mother and a council of regents, primarily the powerful Trinh Ca and Nguyen Zi, both seasoned officials loyal to the Lê dynasty. For a time, the system worked. The court governed with cautious stability, and Lê Nhan Tông grew up in a world shaped entirely by advisors. But family, as we've seen over and over, never likes to stay out of the picture for long. Lurking in the political shadows was Lênh Nghi Dan, Lê Nhan To Eng's elder half-brother. He had once held the title of Crown Prince, but had been replaced by Nhan Tông, much to his resentment. While his younger sibling was being paraded as the divine heir, Nghi Dan was quietly watching from exile, observing the slow unraveling of court alliances and planning his return. By 1459, Lê Nhan Tông was 18 years old and finally ruling in his own name. But the empire was unstable. The regents who had raised him had either been dismissed or executed, and Nhan Tông, though well-intentioned, lacked the authority or cunning to hold the court together. Then came the coup. Late one night, Nghi Dan's supporters infiltrated the royal palace in Thang Long, modern Hanoi. They found Lê Nhan Tông asleep. Within hours, he was dead, struck down by the same family that had once pretended to bow before him. The official history doesn't linger on the details. It doesn't need to. The fact that a half-brother could so easily remove a sitting emperor says enough. Nghi Dan took the throne and styled himself as Lê Nghi Dan, but his reign lasted less than a year. The court that helped him rise quickly turned against him, seeing in his ascension not ambition fulfilled, but legitimacy broken. He was overthrown and killed in a palace revolt. The Lê dynasty would limp on, bloodied but intact. Lê Nhan Tông is remembered today as a victim of dynastic cruelty, a symbol of royal fragility in an era where crowns meant little if not backed by the steel of personal ambition. His crime was being born second, and his punishment was issued by a brother who believed the throne had room for only one lay. And if you thought fratricide was the empire's worst crime, wait until the next heir appears, sits on the throne for just 3 days, and is then removed not by an uncle, not by a noble, but by his own full brother in one of the fastest overthrows in imperial history. Le Long Viet. In the dense thicket of early Vietnamese history, the Le dynasty's lineage is a tangle of ambition, betrayal, and blood. But even among the many violent transitions of power, the fate of Le Long Viet stands out not for how long he reigned, but for how quickly he was eliminated by the very brother who had once sat beside him at court. The year was 1005. Emperor Le Daihan, the founding monarch of the early Le dynasty, had just died. He left behind several sons, all technically eligible to inherit the throne. Unlike other dynasties that followed some rigid principle of primogeniture, succession in early Daiko Viet often resembled a free-for-all. Brothers, cousins, and even in-laws could and did vie for power. Le Long Viet was the designated crown prince, which, in theory, should have made succession smooth. In reality, it made him a target. After a brief and violent struggle between royal brothers, Long Viet managed to emerge as emperor, at least nominally. The court proclaimed him ruler. The royal regalia was passed. For 3 days, he was king. Then he died. The culprit? His younger brother, Le Long Din. Long Din had no interest in formalities. He bypassed the court, the scholars, the laws of the land, and simply had his brother assassinated, just like that. No trial, no palace negotiation, no council of elders debating divine will. The throne changed hands not through a decree, but through elimination. Le Long Din became emperor immediately after, beginning one of the most controversial and infamous reigns in Vietnamese imperial history. Historical chronicles depict him as cruel, decadent, and deeply paranoid, a ruler who executed ministers for minor slights and forced his court into degrading rituals. Later, Vietnamese historians painted him as a tyrant who ruled through fear rather than governance. But no amount of horror stories can erase how he got the throne, by killing his brother, barely 72 hours after that brother had taken it. As for Le Long Viet, history hardly had time to remember him. 3 days is not enough time to make law, change policy, or shape legacy. He became a ghost mentioned more for the manner of his death than for anything he ever ruled. In the end, his name became a placeholder, a grim footnote in a dynasty that defined power by proximity and silenced all questions with the cold logic of fraternal betrayal. And next, we journey to 16th century Siam, where kingship wasn't just a matter of court intrigue, but a dangerous dance between royal lovers where poison brewed in the royal harem and death wore the face of a consort, Che Raka. The Ayutthaya kingdom of Siam in the mid-16th century was a place of Baroque ritual, gilded thrones, and meticulously ranked courtiers who bowed lower than the marble steps they served upon. But even within all that gold and incense, the crown was no more secure than a bowl of soup balanced on a sword. Especially when the hand serving that soup belonged to a royal consort with ambitions far exceeding her station. Sheracha was king from 1534 to 1546, a decade marked by political maneuvering, court drama, and the slow fragmentation of royal authority. He had taken the throne after a string of succession crises and worked to stabilize the kingdom. But peace in Ayutthaya was always fragile, and court factions brewed like monsoon clouds. The greatest of these storms came not from a foreign enemy, but from inside the palace walls, from a woman named Sri Sudachan. Sudachan began her rise as a royal concubine. By all accounts, she was beautiful, intelligent, and calculating. Sharacha, like many kings before him, was charmed. She bore him children and steadily rose in influence, becoming a key figure in court life. But her ambition wasn't maternal, it was dynastic. She wanted more than proximity to the throne. She wanted the throne itself. And so the whispers began. Sharacha reportedly fell ill in 1546, under circumstances suspicious enough that the court chroniclers, normally cagey with their accusations, dared to mention poison. Sudachan, naturally, was one of the few with direct access to the king's food, chambers, and medical care. His death came swiftly and at just the right time for her. Her son, a child, was declared king under the name Yot-Fa. And who would serve as regent? His mother, of course. With her hands on the scepter, Sudachan discarded any pretense of traditional court conduct. She elevated her lover, a commoner named Worawongzathirat, to a position of unprecedented influence. Soon after, she orchestrated her own son's death and installed her lover as king, a man who had no royal blood, no legitimacy, and, in the eyes of the nobility, no right to breathe near the throne. That scandal finally broke the dam. Loyalist nobles, disgusted by the breakdown of royal protocol, staged a swift coup. Both Sudachan and her lover were killed, their brief reign erased from official records like a shameful footnote. But the damage was done. Chayacha's death, likely at the hands of the woman he trusted most, triggered a power vacuum that would destabilize the kingdom for years. In Siamese folklore, Sudachan is remembered as the archetype of the ambitious consort, a reminder that even a queen without a crown can kill a king with one. And speaking of ambitious sons who didn't wait for succession to come to them, our next ruler died not from poison, but from a pillow pressed by a child who wore a smile in public and planned an empire in secret. Halaung Sithu. Sithu. In the twilight of pagan Myanmar's golden age, King Alaung Sithu, also known as Sithu, I stood as a symbol of order, prosperity, and careful diplomacy. His reign, from 1112 to 1167, was marked by temple building, road construction, and a level of administrative coherence that held together a patchwork of ethnic groups and vassal states. He travelled extensively throughout his kingdom, resolving disputes personally, acting not as a distant sovereign but as a monarch in motion. But no journey is long enough to escape betrayal when it lives in your own household. Alaung Sithu's rule wasn't just long, it was successful. He brought stability to pagans' increasingly complex political structure, developed a thriving economy, and fostered Buddhism through monumental construction projects. The temples of Bagan owe much to his reign. And yet, for all his achievements, his biggest failure was personal. He trusted his son. Narathu, his second son, had been ambitious from the beginning. He was not the designated heir. That position belonged to his elder brother, Min Shinsaw. But Narathu was patient and cunning. When his brother was exiled due to a string of rebellious actions, Narathu became crown prince almost by default. But he didn't want to wait for inheritance. And his father, increasingly aged and perhaps unaware of the storm brewing at his side, made a critical mistake. He didn't see the succession as urgent. He ruled until the very end, or so he thought. In 1167, during what was likely meant to be a retirement voyage through the countryside, a final royal circuit of the realm he had governed so long, Alaung Sithu fell ill. Narathu was there, attentive, polite, supportive, the dutiful son. And then, according to chronicles and local legend, Narathu smothered him. The story lacks forensic precision, as medieval histories often do, but the outcome is consistent. The king died under deeply suspicious circumstances, and his son took the throne immediately after. There were no formal rituals of mourning, no extended regency, just a death, a crown, and a new king with blood behind him. Narathu's reign would be short and disastrous. His legitimacy was contested, his rule was violent, and he would eventually be assassinated by assassins from a rival kingdom, possibly even as an act of cosmic retribution for his patricide. But the story of Alain-Sithu lingers longer than that of his son. He was a builder of cities, a weaver of peace, and a monarch who treated power not as a weapon but as a responsibility. And perhaps that's why he was so easily undone. Because kings who rule by consensus rarely see betrayal coming until the room is already empty and the only person left is family. And now we move to northern China, where an emperor who brought stability to his dynasty found that his greatest danger wasn't in court or battle, but asleep in his own bed, where a woman whispered promises and served death with a smile. Emperor Xuanwu. By the time Emperor Xuanwu came to the throne in 499 CE, the Northern Wei dynasty had already tasted chaos, civil unrest, and palace coups. What it needed was a ruler who could cool the fire without losing the spark, a leader not just of military campaigns, but of bureaucratic endurance. Xuanwu fit the role. He ruled from 499 to 515, ascending to power at a young age but displaying maturity far beyond his years. His reign was characterized by cultural development, religious patronage, particularly of Buddhism, and a deep commitment to centralizing imperial authority. He appointed capable ministers, supported infrastructure reforms, and pulled the court back from the brink of factional collapse. But as always in dynasties founded on both conquest and concubines, the personal was always political. And no one knew this better than his wife, Consort Gao. Consort Gao was not empress, but she wielded power as if she were. She was a member of the Gao clan, a politically connected family whose influence had grown uncomfortably large within the imperial court. Gao herself was elegant, shrewd, and endlessly ambitious. She bore Xuanwu a son, securing her place in the line of succession without ever needing a coronation. But behind the scenes, her ambitions were more than maternal. As Xuanwu's health declined, rumors began to swirl. Courtiers whispered of strange illnesses, of symptoms that came and went with no clear diagnosis. And when the emperor died in 515 suddenly, and with little explanation, the rumors crystallized into suspicion. Consort Gao's name appeared again and again in the unofficial histories. No charges were brought, no trials held. But the timing of her ascent right as Xuanwu fell was hard to ignore. She became regent for her young son, Emperor Xiaoming, and effectively ruled the empire. And although she was eventually overthrown and forced into retirement, her brief regency marked a turning point for the dynasty. The emperor who had sought peace and order died surrounded by chaos and silence. The legacy he tried to stabilize crumbled not from rebellion or invasion, but from within his own household. In the end, Xuanwu's death remains a mystery with a narrow suspect list. And next, we dive deeper into the southern courts of China, where two emperors were killed by the same man, a granduncle who made family trees look less like records of lineage and more like hit lists. Xiao Zhaoye. If the southern Qi dynasty had a theme, it might be, don't get too comfortable. And Xiao Zhaoye, the young emperor who ascended the throne in 493, learned that lesson quickly, though not quickly enough to save his life. He was just 21 years old when he became emperor, following the death of his father, Xiao Zhangmao, who had been crown prince but predeceased the reigning emperor, Gao Di. Xiao Zhaoye was thus the designated heir, but not exactly the ideal one. He had a reputation for extravagance and indulgence, which made the bureaucrats uneasy and gave his enemies exactly the kind of evidence they needed. In the early months of his reign, he ruled with a blend of overconfidence and inexperience. He spent lavishly, ignored court protocols, and preferred pleasure to politics. That might have been survivable. Emperors before him had ruled worse if not for the fact that someone in the palace had already decided his reign needed an expiration date. That someone was Xiao Luan, his grand-uncle. Xiao Luan had held high office during previous reigns and was respected, perhaps too respected. He was the kind of official who smiled while taking notes, nodded while gathering allies, and waited until the young emperor had dug his own political grave before stepping in with a very real one. Xiao Luan began by whispering. He suggested reforms, positioned allies, and subtly eroded the emperor's support within the court. Then, in 494, just 1 year into Xiao Zhaoye's reign, the young emperor was assassinated in what was officially described as a palace coup. To protect the state, Xiao Luan emerged as regent, later declaring himself Emperor Ming. The court accepted it with minimal resistance. After all, he had saved them from extravagance, from instability, and most importantly, from a ruler they didn't trust. But the true instability had only just begun. And if you thought one emperor wasn't enough for Xiao Luan's ambition, wait until you see what he did to Xiao Zhaoye's successor, his own hand-picked puppet, who made the fatal mistake of believing the regent had run out of knives. Xiao Zhaowen. The aftermath of Xiao Zhaoye's assassination left a vacuum, and no vacuum in Chinese imperial history remains unfilled for long. Enter Xiao Zhaowen, a teenager thrust into power not because of his merit, but because his granduncle Xiao Luan needed a placeholder. At just 15, Xiao Zhaowen was crowned emperor in 494, directly following the death of his cousin Xiao Zhaoye. But his promotion came with invisible strings. He was, for all intents and purposes, a ceremonial figure. The real power remained with Xiao Luan, now a regent in name but an emperor in practice. The young emperor tried to play his role attending ceremonies, reading memorized proclamations, and sitting through meetings where everyone spoke to Xiao Luan while pretending to bow to him. He wasn't unpopular. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't anything, really. Just a boy, caught in the middle of a dynasty, eating itself from the inside out. And yet, even being harmless wasn't enough to keep him safe. Within a few months of his ascension, Xiao Luan made his move. He accused the boy of incompetence, an ironic charge considering Zhao Wen had never been allowed to make a decision. On paper, Xiao Luan staged a polite deposition. In reality, it was an erasure. Zhao Wen was removed from power and placed under house arrest. Then, predictably, he died. Officially, it was illness. But imperial illness often followed right after imperial removal, as if exile came with a health condition no physician could treat. Xiao Luan then declared himself Emperor Ming, finally shedding the pretense of loyalty to the lineage he had just personally dismantled. Xiao Wen, like his cousin before him, vanished from history in the most tragic way, not through scandal or rebellion, but through irrelevance. He was used, removed, and discarded. A boy whose crown was never his, and whose death was never truly explained. And so, 2 emperors fell not to foreign armies or internal revolts, but to one man with a patient smile and a long memory. A granduncle who played the long game until he no longer had to pretend it was about anything but power. Now we turn from the bureaucratic poison of southern Qi to the sword-swinging chaos of the Abbasid Caliphate, where 2 brothers, Both caliphs tore a world-spanning empire in half, and one died trying to hold it together with a pen in one hand and a dagger pointed at his back. Al-Amin. If Rome was famous for its emperors and Byzantium for its intrigue, then the Abbasid Caliphate was infamous for proving that even divine legitimacy couldn't stop a good old-fashioned family war. Al-Amin. Born to Caliph Harun al-Rashid, the same Harun immortalized in 1001 Nights, was meant to be a golden heir. He was raised in the palace of Baghdad, educated by the best minds of the Islamic Golden Age, and groomed to continue the dynasty's reign over a vast empire stretching from North Africa to Central Asia. His father had a plan. Al-Amin would inherit the core lands of the caliphate, while his half-brother Al-Ma'mun would rule the eastern provinces from Merv. A two-pronged succession designed to preserve unity while rewarding both sons. It was elegant, thoughtful, and absolutely doomed. When Harun died in 809, Al-Amin took the throne. Almost immediately, he began unraveling his father's arrangement. He tried to strip Al-Ma'mun of power, revoke his titles, and summon him back to Baghdad as a subordinate. Al-Ma'mun refused. What followed was a full-blown civil war, one of the bloodiest and most catastrophic in Islamic history. Al-Amin, despite being caliph in name, found his support thinning. His army, led by loyalists, suffered major defeats. Al-Ma'mun, a master strategist, won over generals, scholars, and Eastern governors. His campaign wasn't just military, it was intellectual and political. He promised reform, meritocracy, and rational governance, while Al-Amin clung to titles and traditions. By 813, Al-Ma'mun's forces had reached Baghdad. The siege was brutal, and Al-Amin's situation became desperate. Trapped in his own capital, betrayed by his commanders, and cut off from any meaningful support, he tried to negotiate safe passage. Too late. He was captured attempting to flee and killed shortly after, some say executed, others say assassinated during interrogation. His head was reportedly sent to Al-Ma'mun in Merv, a grotesque symbol of victory that even his supporters found excessive. Al-Amin's downfall wasn't just a cautionary tale, it was a historical fracture. The civil war permanently weakened the Abbasid Caliphate, fracturing its authority and setting the stage for centuries of regional fragmentation. But it also highlighted something more personal: how even in an empire supposedly unified by faith, family loyalty was the first thing to go. A caliph chosen by God, killed by a brother, and remembered as a footnote to a golden age written in blood. Next, we stay in the Abbasid court, but this time, the assassin isn't a rival or a rebel. It's a son, watching his father rule too long and fearing that succession might skip him altogether. Because sometimes, the quickest path to the throne is through the one who gave you life. Al-Mutawakkil. By the mid-9th century, the Abbasid Caliphate had become less an empire and more a chessboard, each square occupied by generals, governors, scholars, and slaves with agendas sharper than their swords. And right in the middle of it all stood Caliph Al-Mutawakkil, a ruler who tried to reverse the tide of his empire's decentralization, only to find that the most dangerous enemy wasn't among his rivals, but seated at his own dinner table. Al-Mutawakkil reigned from 847 to 861, and he ruled with a mission. His predecessors, particularly Al-Ma'mun and Al-Mutasim, had allowed Turkish military elites to gain increasing power over court politics. The caliphate had become a machine running on foreign mercenaries and palace guards who were less interested in religious guidance and more interested in who signed their paychecks. Al-Mutawakkil tried to change that. He promoted traditional Sunni orthodoxy, rolled back earlier policies of rationalist theology, and tried to distance the caliphate from the growing influence of the Turkish military factions. He also built grand structures, most notably the new capital at Samarra, and attempted to re-centralize power around the caliph's court. But control, once lost, is not easily reclaimed. Despite his efforts, the Turkish guards remained a formidable force in the palace, and so al-Mutawakkil turned to a familiar strategy: dynastic manipulation. He designated his son, al-Muntasir, as his successor. Then, worried that al-Muntasir had grown too close to the Turkish factions, he reportedly began showing favor to his other sons. He also humiliated al-Muntasir in court, stripped him of certain honors, and according to some sources, even considered disinheriting him. This was not a smart move. On the night of the 10th of December, 861, al-Mutawakkil dined with his son, al-Muntasir, and several Turkish guards. The next morning, the caliph was dead. Officially, the cause was natural. Unofficially, everyone knew it wasn't. The Turkish guards were the executioners, but the order most likely came from al-Muntasir himself, who wasted no time assuming the caliphate. No trial, no inquiry, just a funeral, a succession, and a very polite silence. Al-Muntasir would only rule for 6 months before dying suddenly under suspiciously similar circumstances, proof that betrayal, once normalized, has no off switch. Al-Mutawakkil's legacy became one of grim irony, a ruler who tried to bring the caliphate back under centralized, religious control, only to be removed by the very military he couldn't defang and the son he had groomed to inherit his mission. And speaking of sons who saw the throne not as inheritance but as competition, our next caliph's fate was sealed the moment his cousin decided that family unity was overrated and that the only thing more divine than succession was ambition. Al-Walid II. Al-Walid II was not the first Umayyad caliph to die violently, but he may have been the most predictable. He came to power in 743, at a moment when the Umayyad Caliphate was already teetering on the edge. The dynasty had ruled for nearly a century, stretching from Spain to Central Asia, but internally it was fracturing. Religious dissent, tribal divisions, and bureaucratic corruption had turned the once mighty state into a powder keg. Then Al-Walid II lit the match. He inherited the throne as the son of Yazid II and ruled for just over a year. His reign was marked by extravagance, excess, and open disdain for traditional piety. Chroniclers, many of them writing after the Abbasids took over, paint him as a hedonist who mocked the Quran, neglected religious duties, and openly antagonized members of the ulama. Whether these accounts are entirely accurate or exaggerated through political bias is unclear, but one thing is certain: Al-Walid II made enemies fast. Among those enemies was his cousin, Yazid III. Yazid, unlike Al-Walid, positioned himself as a pious, just ruler, a man of principle. He used religious rhetoric to rally support, accusing Al-Walid of corruption and moral decay. But this wasn't just a sermon. It was a coup in the making. In 744, just over a year into Al-Walid's reign, Yazid launched his rebellion. The caliph tried to rally his forces, but tribal factions abandoned him. He fled to Palmyra, hoping to regroup. He never made it. Al-Walid was captured by his cousin's forces and killed. His body was discarded with little ceremony, no state funeral, no elegy. Just a footnote in a dynasty that had lost its ideological grip long before it lost its throne. Yazid III became caliph, But his rule was just as short. The civil war he ignited became a wildfire. Within a few years, the Umayyad dynasty collapsed entirely, replaced by the Abbasids, who would go on to write the official histories. And not kindly. Al-Walid II's death was not just the fall of a man. It was the fall of a myth, the idea that divine right could survive unchecked power, that family could hold an empire together, or that cousins made for loyal subordinates. He ruled in excess. He died in exile, and he was replaced by a man who claimed to restore virtue until the cycle repeated again. And in our next story, the victim is yet another Abbasid caliph, this time killed not by a cousin or a guard, but by an internal political swap where surrender became a death sentence, and abdication was nothing more than a formality before execution. Al-Musta'in. The Abbasid Caliphate, in its later years, became a theatre of shifting loyalties and increasingly powerless caliphs, none more emblematic of that tragic transformation than Al-Musta'in. When he was chosen to rule in 862 CE, Al-Musta'in wasn't the strongest candidate, just the most convenient. He was placed on the throne by a faction of Turkish military officers who had essentially taken control of the empire after a string of unstable reigns. His elevation was less a coronation and more a corporate appointment with the caliphate, now functioning like a fragile military-backed boardroom. His rule lasted 4 years, and those 4 years were nothing short of torment. Factions split almost immediately. One group supported Al-Musta'in in Baghdad, another backed Al-Mu'taz, another Abbasid prince in Samarra. Civil war followed, not grand armies and glorious sieges, but chaotic skirmishes, bribery, assassinations, and shifting allegiances. The Caliph, once considered the leader of the Muslim world, now found himself begging for loyalty in a capital that no longer feared him. By 866, it was over. The Turkish military elite, seeing Al-Musta'in as more trouble than he was worth, negotiated a deal. He would abdicate the throne in favor of Al-Mu'taz and, in return, be allowed to retire in peace. He agreed. He wrote the abdication himself, publicly accepted the terms, handed over the regalia, moved into what was supposed to be a quiet retirement on the banks of the Tigris. Months later, he was executed. No charges, no announcement, no rebellion, just another caliph quietly removed from the world he once ruled. His death marked more than just the end of a man. It marked the degradation of the caliphate itself. The office that once represented divine authority on earth had become so politicized, so manipulated by military power, that its holders were now little more than disposable middlemen in a game they no longer controlled. Al-Musta'in's greatest mistake wasn't losing a war or mismanaging the empire. It was believing that abdication could save him. And next, we travel to the misty highlands of Kashmir, where a queen ruled with iron precision, and where 3 generations of kings found themselves quietly erased by a woman whose power outlasted all of them. Nandagupta. In the rugged, snow-kissed valleys of 10th century Kashmir, royal succession wasn't a ritual, it was a game of subtraction. And Queen Dida, the so-called Catherine the Great of the East, played it with terrifying precision. Over her reign, she outlived, outmaneuvered, and outlasted nearly every man who stood in her path. Nandagupta was the first. To understand what happened to Nandagupta, you need to understand Dida. She wasn't born into power, but married into it, becoming queen consort of Kshemagupta. When he died in 958 CE, their young son, Abhimanyu II, took the throne too young to rule. Of course, so Dida stepped in as regent. That's when the game changed. Dida ruled with sharp intelligence and a sharper temper. She eliminated dissenters, crushed rebellions, and slowly built her own base of loyal courtiers and commanders. When Abhimanyu II died, conveniently and quietly, Dida didn't step aside. She installed her grandson, Nandagupta, as the next king, and kept the regency, of course. Nandagupta was young, soft-spoken, and widely considered incapable of ruling. But more importantly, he was unnecessary. Dida wanted power, not just influence. And a teenage king, even her own grandson, was a liability. So, after just a few months on the throne, Nandagupta was deposed. The official justification? Incompetence. The real reason? He was a warm-up act, a placeholder, an heir who had overstayed his usefulness. Shortly after his deposition, Nandagupta died under mysterious circumstances. No assassination, no rebellion, no execution order, just a smooth, bureaucratic disappearance, the kind Dida specialized in. She didn't flinch. She simply appointed another grandson to the throne, smiled at the court, and continued running the kingdom like it was her private household. Nandagupta left no legacy, no policy, no rebellion in his name, just a royal title that passed through his hands like a ghost, and a grandmother who treated bloodlines like chess pieces. And if you think that was cold, wait until you meet his younger brother appointed next, adored even less, and dispatched with just as little ceremony. Tribhuvangupta. If Nandagupta was the first experiment in royal disposability, Tribhuvangupta was the second, and by this point, Queen Dida had perfected the formula. Following Nandagupta's untimely exit, Dida placed Tribhuvangupta on the throne. Once again, she retained full control as regent. Once again, the boy was too young, too timid, too politically irrelevant to pose a threat, which meant he was also too easy to remove. Tribhuvangupta's reign lasted just long enough for Dida to make sure no rivals had consolidated around him. The court had grown used to this pattern by now. Young king, short rule, quiet death. It was less a monarchy and more a recurring stage, play different actors, same ending, always written by Dida. No contemporary records accuse her directly, but they don't need to. The pattern speaks louder than any chronicler's pen. Like his brother before him, Tribhuvangupta disappeared from the royal chronicles with a whisper. There were no royal funerals, no declarations of mourning, just a change in names, a shift in titles, and the steady march of Dida's control. She appointed a third grandson next. No one dared to ask why the first two had vanished. Dida was no longer simply regent, she was the state. The army answered to her. The ministers bowed to her. The people feared her. And when Tribhuvangupta vanished, she didn't bother justifying it. She didn't need to. In a world ruled by dynasty, she was the dynasty. And yet, the story doesn't end here. Because the third grandson would learn, too late, that surviving Dida's affection was no guarantee of survival, especially once she realized she no longer needed grandsons at all. Bhimagupta. By the time Bhimagupta became king, everyone in Kashmir already knew how the story ended. He was the third of Queen Dida's grandsons to wear the crown, the last placeholder, the final act in a dynasty that had become her personal stage. The court was silent, the ministers resigned, the people indifferent. Bhimagupta may have been named king, but the real ruler still sat behind the curtain, holding the strings. And Dida had grown tired of strings. Bhimagupta was just old enough to show signs of independence. He made minor decisions, held court meetings, gave orders, and perhaps most dangerously began to believe he was king in more than just name. Dida noticed. She had spent years using children as political shields, temporary rulers to placate the court while she wielded the power. But she was done waiting. She had survived her husband, her son, and now 3 grandsons. And she had learned something from each one, that no man, no matter how close, could be trusted to stay out of her way. So she removed Bhimagupta. Like the others, he was deposed without bloodshed, at least none publicly recorded. The court was informed, the document signed, a royal announcement made, and Bhimagupta faded into the same mist that had swallowed his brothers. But this time there was no replacement. Dida didn't install another puppet. She declared herself sovereign. Queen Dida, no longer regent, no longer the quiet power behind the throne, took the crown in her own name and ruled Kashmir directly for nearly 2 more decades. Her reign was firm, feared, and, by some accounts, effective. She brought stability, crushed dissent, and proved that ruling alone was not only possible, it was preferable. Bhimagupta became the final lesson that even loyalty and blood couldn't protect you if you stood between Dida and her throne. 3 grandsons, 3 vanished kings, 1 surviving monarch. And in our next story, we leave the icy stillness of Kashmir for the political frost of 16th century Sweden, where a paranoid monarch was undone not by revolution or foreign plot, but by the quiet machinations of a brother who smiled too often and asked too few questions. Erik X14. Erik XIV of Sweden was the kind of ruler who belonged in a Shakespearean tragedy, brilliant, erratic, suspicious, and increasingly isolated by the very genius that once made him promising. His reign, from 1560 to 1568, began with optimism and ended in paranoia, imprisonment, and a final chapter written by the most quietly ambitious character of all, his own brother. Erik was the son of Gustav Vasa, Sweden's first modern king, and inherited a country in the midst of transformation from feudal patchwork to centralized state, from Catholic tradition to Protestant rigor. He had a sharp intellect and a taste for the arts and sciences. He spoke multiple languages, dabbled in astrology, and saw himself as the architect of a modern Swedish monarchy. But for every flash of brilliance, there was a shadow. Erik distrusted the nobility. He believed, perhaps rightly, that they were conspiring against him. He targeted prominent aristocrats with accusations of treason, some of which led to imprisonment, others to execution. Most infamously, in 1567, he ordered the killing of several members of the powerful Sture family, an event known as the Sture murders that turned public sentiment sharply against him. Around this time, his mental state began to deteriorate. Reports from the court describe erratic behavior, sudden mood swings, and prolonged episodes of withdrawal. Whether he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or simply the isolation of unchecked power, historians still debate. But what's clear is that by the late 1562, Erik had become a prisoner of his own mind, and his throne became the one place he could no longer safely sit. And standing quietly in the wings, his younger brother, John. John had once been imprisoned by Erik himself for negotiating with Poland without royal permission, but Erik released him an act of either mercy or miscalculation. John returned to court with the air of a loyal sibling, but moved with the precision of a man who knew exactly when to strike. In 1568, John led a rebellion. It was swift, surgical, and successful. Erik was captured and deposed. The official reason was his declining health. The unofficial reason was his growing unpopularity and John's growing patience. Erik would live for nearly a decade in captivity, moved from one castle to another, always under guard. Then, in 1577, after years of silence and confinement, he died. The official records cited natural causes, but a persistent rumor and later forensic studies suggest he was poisoned. By whom? No direct evidence points to John III, who had since taken the throne, but it's hard to ignore the timing or the pattern. A sickly ex-king, an ambitious brother, and a death that solved every political problem in one silent breath. And now, from the icy fjords of Sweden, we sail westward to Norway, where another king named Harald would find that royal titles don't protect against ambition wrapped in kinship, and that the Bluetooth everyone remembers today was once a real man with a very real taste for power. Harald Greycloak. Harald Greycloak was born into the kind of bloodline that almost guaranteed a short reign. He was a son of Eirik Bloodaxe, a name that doesn't exactly scream diplomatic legacy, and grandson of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unify Norway, at least temporarily. With that kind of family tree, you didn't just inherit land, you inherited vendettas. Harald ruled Norway in the mid-10th century, a time when kingship meant less centralized bureaucracy and more surviving the next ambush. After his father's death, Harald and his brothers found themselves under the guardianship of their uncle, Harald Bluetooth, yes, the very king after whom the modern wireless technology is named. Bluetooth ruled Denmark and, at the time, held significant influence in southern Norway. Initially, the relationship seemed cooperative. Bluetooth supported his nephews, perhaps seeing in them useful pawns to extend his own reach. But Harald Greycloak had ambitions of his own. After consolidating power, he began asserting more independence, extending his control over parts of western and northern Norway, and reducing Danish influence. This, of course, was a problem. Bluetooth preferred his vassals pliant and his relatives grateful. Harald was neither. The turning point came when Harald began eliminating local jarls, regional lords, who were loyal to Denmark. It was a direct challenge to Bluetooth's authority. And Bluetooth, like any good monarch with an ego and a fleet, responded the way kings often do, with strategy rather than open war. He withdrew his support from Harald. More than that, he began quietly backing a rival claimant, Håkon Sigurdsson, a powerful jarl from Trøndelag who had once been overlooked, but now seemed like a convenient alternative. In 970, Harald Greycloak was lured into a trap under the pretense of a political meeting. Ambushed and killed, his reign ended not with a rebellion, but with a betrayal so quiet it might have sounded like diplomacy. Harald Bluetooth denied direct involvement, but the chain of events, the orchestration of alliances, and the stunning speed with which Håkon Sigurdsson assumed power suggests otherwise. Harald Greycloak was gone. His brothers scattered. Norwegian autonomy slipped once more under Danish shadow. It's an ancient truth that kings rarely fall to enemies with banners and horns. They fall to family with quiet hands and longer memories. Which brings us to our next monarch, a Scottish king who ruled not by conquest, but by inheritance, until his own son turned the battlefield into a coronation, and bloodlines into afterthoughts. James III. James III of Scotland ruled from 1460 to 1488, a reign best described as politically tone-deaf and spiritually doomed. He inherited the throne as a child after his father died in battle, but grew up to be a king who trusted no one, disliked his own nobility, and preferred art to arms' fatal preferences, in a land where chivalry was still very much a contact sport. James had some royal quirks. He enjoyed music, architecture, and astrology more than governance. He ignored his nobles, elevated obscure favourites to high office, and failed to court the powerful clans that held Scotland's fate in their swords. His attempts at diplomacy with England were sporadic and often incoherent, while at home he treated the Parliament with disdain. But perhaps his gravest mistake was how he treated his son. James IV, his eldest, was charismatic, popular, and most dangerously embarrassed by his father. As tensions with the nobility worsened, many lords began rallying around the young prince. James III, in a panic, arrested prominent nobles, including his own brothers, and retreated into increasingly isolated rule. In 1488, the resentment finally boiled over. A full-scale rebellion broke out, with James IV perhaps reluctantly placed at its head. James III tried to gather forces, but his reputation had been so thoroughly poisoned that support was lukewarm. At the Battle of Southeyburn in June 1488, his forces were defeated. James III fled the field but was intercepted during his escape and killed. The official account said he died in battle. The unofficial story, and the one most historians believe, is that he was murdered after being captured, likely with the knowledge or quiet approval of his son's supporters. James IV, haunted by the act for the rest of his life, wore an iron chain around his waist as penance. But remorse didn't prevent him from becoming one of Scotland's most celebrated. James III's legacy is a cautionary tale. A king who alienated everyone close to him, including the one person who should have been his greatest ally. He raised a son, then raised a rebellion. And in our next tale, we enter Imperial Russia, where a German-born Tsar ruled for just 6 months before his wife decided she'd rather lead alone and sent him packing into history's most awkward footnote, Peter III. Peter III of Russia was a walking contradiction in a crown. He worshipped the Prussian king, alienated the Russian Orthodox Church, insulted the nobility, and showed more interest in tin soldiers than real ones. He also happened to be married to Catherine the Great, who, despite the title, started off merely as a patient observer, until she decided waiting was no longer a strategy. Born Karl Peter Ulrich of Holstein-Gottorp, Peter was a German duke who found himself improbably elevated to the Russian throne in 1762. He was the grandson of Peter the Great and was dragged into the Russian court as heir after Empress Elizabeth, his aunt, died. The transition was jarring. Peter never fully adapted to Russian customs, language, or politics. He remained thoroughly German in taste, demeanour, and unfortunately diplomacy. Within weeks of becoming emperor, Peter III managed to offend nearly every power bloc in Russia. He pulled Russia out of the 7 Years' War just as it was gaining the upper hand against Prussia, his favourite country. He handed back territories that Russian soldiers had died conquering. He introduced reforms without consulting the nobility and issued decrees that favoured German interests over Russian ones. He even alienated the Orthodox Church by proposing the secularization of church lands. And all the while, Catherine was watching. Their marriage had never been one of love. It was arranged, distant, and increasingly political. Catherine was more Russian than Peter in every way that mattered. She spoke the language, understood the people, and built careful alliances with the military, the church, and the nobility. She had spent years cultivating favour in the shadows while her husband strutted in his Prussian boots. So when the time came, she acted. In July 1762, just 6 months into Peter's reign, Catherine launched a coup. With the support of the elite Izmailovsky regiment and several influential nobles, she declared herself Empress. Peter, caught off guard, tried to flee but was captured. He abdicated without a fight. 8 days later, he was dead. The official account claimed apoplexy. The unofficial story whispered even at the time pointed to assassination, most likely with the knowledge, if not the command, of Catherine's allies. Some believed Alexei Orlov, a key conspirator, had personally delivered the final blow. Catherine never publicly acknowledged any role in her husband's death, but she never punished anyone for it either. Peter III became a historical ghost, a strange, ill-fitting monarch who ruled briefly, fell quickly, and was remembered mostly for how utterly un-Russian he was. And next, we stay in Imperial Russia, where the royal family found itself once again tangled in family politics, this time between a father known for his paranoia and a son who may have waited just a little too patiently for the crown to fall into his hands. Paul I. Paul I of Russia spent most of his life as the world's most impatient heir. The son of Catherine the Great and Peter III, he watched his mother rule for over 3 decades while he lingered in her shadow, shuffled around court like an afterthought. When he finally ascended to the throne in 1796, it was less a coronation and more a delayed reaction. And by then, Paul had developed a complex relationship with power, one built on suspicion, control, and an urgent desire to reshape the empire in his own image. His reign began with energy. He reversed many of Catherine's policies, centralized authority under the monarchy, and tried to reform the nobility, whom he distrusted deeply. He restructured military regulations, demanded absolute loyalty, and operated under the belief that order could be restored only through micromanagement. But what Paul saw as reform, the court saw as tyranny. He ruled erratically. He issued sudden decrees, punished perceived slights with harshness, and surrounded himself with advisors few others trusted. The nobility accustomed to Catherine's subtle hand bristled under Paul's authoritarianism. His paranoia didn't help. He suspected conspiracies everywhere, limited foreign travel, and lived in fear of coups. Ironically, it was this fear that made one inevitable. In March 1801, a group of senior nobles and military officers plotted to remove Paul. Their motive was self-preservation. They feared he would plunge Russia into chaos or align too closely with Napoleon, with whom Paul had recently begun making diplomatic overtures. The plotters included some of Paul's closest confidants, men he had trusted, men he had elevated. And in the background of this silent conspiracy, his son, Alexander. There is no definitive evidence that Alexander I participated in the planning of the coup, but it's widely believed that he was aware of it and chose not to intervene. On the night of the 23rd of March, conspirators entered Paul's chambers in St. Michael's Castle. The emperor was confronted, cornered, and ultimately killed. The method, as always, was officially cloaked in ambiguity. The truth, however, was whispered openly. It was a palace assassination. The next morning, Alexander I was declared emperor. He was visibly shaken by the news of his father's death, whether from guilt or surprise is up for debate. He ruled for the next quarter century, becoming one of Russia's most celebrated monarchs, the man who helped defeat Napoleon and presided over the Congress of Vienna. But the shadow of his father's death never fully left him. Paul I, like so many monarchs in this long parade of betrayal, died not because he was hated by the people, but because he was feared by the elites. His son inherited more than the crown. He inherited a cautionary tale in blood. And next, we descend from the gilded halls of Russia to the stone towers of medieval Serbia, where a king discovered that passing your crown to your son doesn't mean you'll be allowed to die in peace. Stefan Dzhanski. Stefan Uroš III, more commonly known as Stefan Dzhanski, was king of Serbia from 1321 to 1331. a ruler caught between the old traditions of dynastic piety and the sharp edge of ambition wielded by his own heir. Stefan came to power in the turbulent aftermath of his father's death, having once been exiled and even blinded during internal disputes. Somehow, he survived. He returned to the political scene, regained his sight either miraculously or medically, and claimed the throne after a brief civil war. His reign was marked by consolidation, legal reform, and the construction of the famed Vysoki Dechani monastery, which still stands today. But while he built cathedrals and restored order, a different kind of foundation was forming beneath him, a quiet rebellion. And its architect was his own son, Stefan Dusan. Dusan had been raised in court, trained in military command, and appointed as heir. By all accounts, he was a competent and charismatic prince, but ambition simmered just below the surface. He began gathering support among the nobility, many of whom saw the young prince as a more decisive and expansionist leader than his cautious father. By 1331, the tension snapped. A full-scale conflict erupted between father and son. The causes were many: political disagreement, court factionalism, and perhaps a generational impatience that saw Stefan's measured rule as weakness. Dusan, backed by a growing number of nobles, marched on his father. Stefan was captured and imprisoned. A few months later, he was dead. The official story? Illness. The unofficial consensus? Quiet execution. Dusan took the throne and was later crowned as Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, launching Serbia into its golden age. His reign saw vast territorial expansion and unprecedented prestige. But the crown he wore had a crack running through its base, a father's blood. Stefan Dechanski's death became one of those historical footnotes that lingers longer than the pages it's printed on. A reminder that kings don't always die on thrones or in peace, and that sometimes the future of a nation is built on the silencing of its past. And next, we return to the Byzantine Empire one final time, where the lights of Constantinople were dimmed not by foreign invaders, but by a brother's ambition and a second blinding that led to the fall of a man once restored by fate. Isaac II, Angelos. In the Byzantine Empire, nothing went to waste, not even the eyes of a deposed emperor. That's what makes the story of Isaac II Angelos particularly cruel. His life, his power, and even his dignity were handed to him by the same dynasty that eventually took it all away. Twice. Isaac came to the throne in 1185 after leading a successful revolt against Andronikos I Komnenos, a deeply unpopular emperor whose cruelty had pushed the aristocracy and the church to their limits. Isaac was seen, at first, as a breath of fresh air. He was young, articulate, and promised to reverse the terror of his predecessor's reign. But the thing about fresh air in Constantinople was it rarely stayed clean for long. His rule was plagued with familiar Byzantine problems: crumbling borders, rising taxes, and the dangerous dance of diplomacy with both the West and the Turks. The treasury was empty. The army was restless. And Isaac, despite flashes of competence, proved better at pageantry than policy. He spent lavishly on ceremonies, promised rewards he couldn't afford, and slowly alienated the same nobles who had lifted him up. And one of those nobles was his own brother, Alexios III. In 1195, while Isaac was on a hunting trip in Thrace, his brother staged a bloodless coup. The court declared Isaac unfit to rule, citing his physical ailments and poor leadership. When Isaac returned, confused and unarmed, he was arrested and promptly blinded. In Byzantine tradition, blinding rendered a man ineligible to rule. It was both a punishment and a political tool. But fate wasn't done with Isaac just yet. In 1203, a bizarre twist of history gave him a second chance. His son, Alexios IV, fled to the west and enlisted the Fourth Crusade to help restore his father. The Crusaders, in return for promises of money and favors, marched on Constantinople and reinstated the blinded Isaac as co-emperor alongside his son. It did not go well. The people resented the Latin presence. The treasury was still empty, and neither Isaac nor his son could control the storm they had summoned. Less than a year later, a palace coup killed Alexios IV. Isaac, old, blind, and bewildered, died shortly thereafter. Some say of grief, others say he was quietly disposed of by the new emperor. Isaac II Angelos came to power on a wave of rebellion and ended his days a prisoner in his own palace twice, once at the hands of his enemies and once at the hands of his own family. Next, we leave Byzantium for a modern kingdom nestled in the Himalayas where royal massacre was no metaphor and an entire generation of monarchy was extinguished in one night, allegedly by the very man who should have inherited it all, King Birendra. When King Birendra of Nepal came to the throne in 1972, the world was changing fast, and so was his country. Nepal, tucked between two superpowers, had managed to preserve its monarchy through centuries of political balancing acts. But by the late 20th century, cracks were forming in the palace walls, and the storm that eventually shattered the crown would come from within. Birendra was considered a benevolent monarch. Educated in Eton, Harvard, and Tokyo, he tried to modernize Nepal while maintaining the cultural sanctity of the throne. He introduced a panchayat system, an indirect form of democracy but retained royal authority. His rule was marked by efforts to balance tradition with reform, but beneath the calm exterior, tensions brewed. On the 1st of June 2001, the Nepalese royal family gathered for a dinner at the Narayanhiti Royal Palace. It was a quiet, private affair, a family evening. At the center of it all was Crown Prince Dipendra, Birendra's eldest son and heir apparent. What happened next remains one of the most controversial, tragic, and mysterious events in modern royal history. By the end of the night, King Birendra, Queen Aishwarya, Prince Nirajan, and several other royal family members were dead. The official story claimed Dipendra, possibly enraged over a dispute involving his marriage plans, carried out the massacre before turning the weapon on himself. But Dipendra didn't die immediately. He lingered in a coma for 3 days. During that time, he was technically declared king, making him the only monarch in history to rule while unconscious and accused of killing his own family. When he died on the 4th of June, the crown passed to Gyanendra, Birendra's younger brother, who had not been present at the dinner. Theories flourished. Some believed Dipendra acted alone, driven by despair and royal disillusionment. Others suspected deeper political motives, a cover-up to eliminate an increasingly reform-minded king and his heirs. The investigation was swift, sealed, and unsatisfying. The country was never given closure, only a funeral and a sudden shift in power. King Birendra's death was more than a loss, it was a collapse of faith. He had symbolized continuity, unity, and monarchy in a time of growing republican sentiment. After his death, public trust in the monarchy disintegrated. Gyanendra's later rule would be marked by protests, unrest, and, eventually, the complete abolition of the monarchy in 2008. Birendra, like so many kings before him, died, surrounded by family. But in his case, that wasn't a comfort, it was the danger. And next, we return to the ancient world, where a Persian emperor known for his splendor fell victim to the oldest story in dynastic history. A son too impatient, a court too complicit, and a crown that passed through blood instead of inheritance. Khosrow II, Parviz. Khosrow II, Parviz, the last great Sasanian emperor, presided over one of the most extravagant courts the ancient world had ever seen. His palaces glittered with gold, his armies spanned vast territories, and his enemies, including the Eastern Romans, learned quickly not to underestimate his resolve. But as with all things built too quickly and held too tightly, his empire began to buckle, and when it did, the collapse came from within. Khosrow ruled from 590 to 628 CE, during a time of near constant warfare. He fought against the Byzantines, took Jerusalem, and stretched the Persian Empire to its zenith. His court was a dazzling showcase of Sasanian culture, wealth, and religious influence. Zoroastrian fire temples dotted the empire. The royal treasury overflowed, and Khosrow himself styled his reign as divinely ordained. But prolonged warfare drained the empire's resources. The final war against Byzantium under Emperor Heraclius pushed Persia to its limits. Cities were sacked, fortunes lost. The military, once loyal, grew discontent. And amid this exhaustion stood Kavad II, Khosrow's son. Kavad had been sidelined for much of his life. He was not Khosrow's favoured heir, and many believe he feared being passed over entirely. When Heraclius launched a daring counter-offensive and began winning back lost territory, Khosrow's image of divine invincibility began to fracture. The nobility, long frustrated by his heavy-handed rule, began looking for alternatives. They found one in Kavad. In 628, Kavad led a palace coup, backed by powerful generals and nobles. Khosrow was arrested and imprisoned. After several weeks in confinement, the once great emperor was executed on the orders of his son. Kavad's reign, though, was short-lived. He died just a few months later, likely of plague, after having ordered the execution of most of his brothers to secure his rule. His brief time on the throne was one of damage control, not rebuilding. Khosrow's death marked the end of Sasanian grandeur. The empire, already weakened, collapsed within a few years under the Arab-Muslim conquests. His fall became a symbol not just of dynastic betrayal, but of an era's end. Khosrow ruled with divine confidence. His palaces echoed with music and power, but in the end, his legacy crumbled not beneath the weight of foreign enemies, but under the boot of his own blood. And in our final tale, we stay in Persia just a little longer, where one last brother decided that power was worth more than kinship, and the only way forward was to erase the past. Hormizd III. If the Sasanian Empire was a tree, it didn't rot from the outside, it was hacked down by its own branches. Hormizd III was one of those branches, and his death in 457 CE was less an execution than a reallocation of assets. His brother, Peroz I, wanted the crown. Hormizd had it. One of them had to blink. But in Persia's imperial playbook, blinking usually meant bleeding. Hormizd III was the son of Yazdegerd II and took the throne in a moment of crisis. His succession was contested from the outset, with factions across the empire split over which son should rule. The eastern provinces, always a little more independent, a little more suspicious of centralized control, backed Peroz. The western court and capital supported Hormizd. In a better world, they might have negotiated a compromise. In this one, they raised armies. What followed was a 2-year civil war, not one of great legendary battles or epic victories, but of careful positioning, shifting alliances, and betrayals within royal ranks. For a brief moment, the empire had two shahs, one in the west, commanding ceremony and tradition, the other in the east, commanding troops and ambition. Peroz. Backed by the influential Hephthalites, the so-called White Huns had both strategic support and raw power. The Hephthalites were formidable allies with their own reasons for getting involved. A fractured Sasanian state was good for business, and a pliable monarch on the throne even better. Hormizd held out as long as he could, but with the East rising and his own supporters dwindling, the scales began to tip. In 457, Peroz captured Hormizd and swiftly eliminated him. The chronicles are silent on whether there was a trial. Most agree there wasn't. The logic of royal succession in that age didn't permit it. A living brother with a claim to the throne was a permanent liability. Hormizd died not because he was cruel or incompetent, but because he was inconvenient. Peroz I would go on to rule for 2 decades. His reign had its share of victories and disasters, including a series of catastrophic defeats against the Hephthalites, his former allies, who turned on him not long after he became emperor. One might say betrayal ran in the family and out of it. Hormizd III remains one of the quieter casualties in Persian history, overshadowed by greater emperors and louder battles. But his death marked more than the end of a reign. It was the final page in this long, bloody chronicle of royal kinslaying. 53 kings and queens, emperors and empresses, caliphs and consorts murdered not by enemies from without, but by blood from within. Sons slaying fathers, wives toppling husbands, cousins, uncles, daughters all trading lineage for leverage, inheritance for ambition. And so, the paradox of monarchy reveals itself. The closer you are to power, the more dangerous you become not just to others, but to yourself. Because history doesn't crown heirs, it buries them. And family? Family is just the blade you didn't see coming.